Settle yourself in a comfortable position. Allow your shoulders to soften and your breath to find a slow, easy rhythm. We are about to drift back in time, to a world that is both strange and familiar, distant and yet somehow still connected to us. Imagine the quiet before dawn, not in the world you know, but in a place where the streets are narrow, where the houses lean inwards toward each other, and where the air is already heavy with the scent of yesterday's labors. A place where the clanging of a church bell, somewhere in the darkness, signals the start of another day, not for you to enjoy at leisure, but to survive. Tonight, we will wander through the life of a medieval city. We will follow its inhabitants as they rise, work, eat, and rest, though their rest is never quite as soft or certain as ours. We will meet a merchant whose ambition carried him higher than kings thought possible. We will look for treasures of knowledge, thought long lost, hidden away for centuries, and we will sit, quietly, at the edge of a banquet table, where the elite display their wealth and power in ways that speak without words. But we will begin where all days in the medieval city began, in the narrow streets, before the sun has risen, when the day's work still lies ahead, and the first task is simply to endure. Imagine opening your eyes to a grey and shadowed ceiling, a low roof of rough wooden beams. The room is cold, not crisp and refreshing, but damp and unyielding, the kind of cold that has settled into the walls themselves. You can hear, faintly at first, the distant bell of the parish church. It is not a melody, it is a flat, heavy note repeated again and again, carrying through the fog of the early morning. It is your signal to rise. You push aside a blanket that is little more than a coarse woolen cloth. Beneath it, your clothes from yesterday and the day before that cling to you with a stiffness that comes from the air's moisture. There is no fireplace in this small dwelling. The warmth must come from your own movement. Stepping outside, the first thing you notice is the uneven cobblestone beneath your feet. The street is narrow, hemmed in by houses with upper floors that lean out, almost meeting above you. The air is thick with the remnants of yesterday's life, the sharp tang of animal waste, the sourness of spoiled vegetables thrown from kitchen doors, and the acrid smoke from the tanner's workshop just a few houses away. This is the constant backdrop of the city's scent. You move toward the market square, for that is where the day's work will take you. The streets are already filling, though the sun has not yet risen. Merchants are setting out their goods, covering tables with rough linen to shield them from the ever-present dust. Fishmongers arrange their catch in neat rows, though the smell is strong enough to carry far down the lane. Here, in the market, you must jostle with others for space, for a good place to display your wares, or for a chance to buy bread before the best loaves are gone. There is little sense of personal space. Elbows brush against you, baskets swing close to your knees. The noise builds slowly, voices calling out greetings, the bleating of goats, the cry of a cart driver urging his horse forward. There is no running water in the streets, and so the refuse of yesterday's market still clings to the edges. A cabbage leaf flattened into the stones, a dark patch where something was spilled, a scattering of feathers from a butcher's stall. The threat of fire is constant here. Every house is built close to its neighbor, and every hearth and candle is a risk. You know of families who lost all they owned to the flames, and so you tread carefully past the blackened remains of a building on the corner. It has been weeks since the blaze, but the smell of char still lingers if the wind turns the wrong way. Disease, too, is never far away. You do not see it in every face, but you hear it in the coughs that echo from the alleys, in the slow movements of those weakened by fever. You are wary of touching surfaces, though in truth there is no escape from the invisible dangers that pass from hand to hand, from water to cup. As the morning wears on, you find your rhythm, lifting, carrying, trading, haggling, but the strain of it settles in your shoulders. Time moves differently here. The day is divided not by clocks, but by the bells that mark the hours, and by the shifting of the light between the close-pressed buildings. By midday, the market is at its busiest. The crowd is dense now, and you find yourself stepping into the gutter to avoid a group of apprentices carrying barrels toward the alehouse. Your feet are damp. You try not to think about what seeps into your shoes from the puddles. When the sun dips behind the roofs, your work is still not done. You return home carrying what you could not sell, hoping to barter it later or preserve it before it spoils. The city does not quiet easily. The ringing of the blacksmith's hammer continues into the evening, mingling with the call of street vendors offering hot pies and roasted chestnuts. By the time you close your eyes again, you have walked miles without leaving the city walls. Your body aches from the constant movement, your ears ring with the overlapping sounds, and the cold has never truly left you. It is clear you would not last a day here without learning the rhythm of the streets, the unspoken rules of the market, and the patience to endure the constant press of life on every side. If you step away from the crowded market for a moment, winding through a side street lined with tall stone buildings, you might imagine a very different life, one that rises above the daily scramble for bread or coin. And in the middle of the 15th century, few men embodied that rise more than Jacques Coeur, a merchant whose name would be known across kingdoms. He was not born to great wealth. His early life is still a little hazy to historians. Some say his father was a furrier in the city of But, working with the pelts of beaver and marten, selling them to those who could afford fine winter garments. Others suggest the family may have been involved in money lending. Whatever the truth, young Jacques would have grown up surrounded by the scent of cured hides, the sound of street vendors, and the sight of coins changing hands, all things that, perhaps, planted in him an instinct for trade. Imagine him as a young man, standing at the edge of the marketplace, watching merchants from Genoa and Venice unfurl bales of silk and roll open barrels of spices. The world beyond France must have felt vast and tantalizing. But where others saw only wonder, Jacques saw opportunity. By his 20s, he had entered into business partnerships that reached beyond local markets. He invested in ships, sent goods to ports far along the Mediterranean, and brought back cargo that would fetch a fine price. Silks from the Levant, sugar from Cyprus, and even delicate glassware from Venice. In a time when most people never traveled beyond a day's walk from their birthplace, Jacques' reach extended across seas. His success did not go unnoticed. Charles VII, King of France, was in need of funds. The 100 Years' War had drained the kingdom's coffers, and the crown often relied on wealthy financiers to provide the means to keep armies paid and supplies flowing. Jacques became the king's argentier, the royal treasurer, a position that allowed him to handle the finances of the realm. It was a role of immense trust and immense risk. Imagine yourself in his position. You are a commoner in birth, yet you move in royal chambers, speaking directly to the king. Your advice weighing on the scale of national decisions. You are useful, but you are also vulnerable. Your power depends on the king's favor, and that favor can vanish in a single breath. Jacques used his influence to build an empire of trade. He established what some have called the first French trading fleet, with ships sailing as far as the Levant and the Black Sea. He traded in precious metals, rare fabrics, and exotic spices, each cargo a small fortune in itself. His home in Bourges became a showpiece, richly decorated, filled with objects from across the known world. The floors tiled in intricate patterns, the walls hung with woven tapestries, the rooms lit by fine Venetian glass lamps. Even the air in his halls would have carried traces of incense and exotic woods. But success in a medieval court often drew envy. Whispers began to spread. Accusations of fraud, of illicit dealings, of overstepping the limits of his station. Some claimed he had enriched himself at the king's expense. Others suggested that he was too close to foreign merchants, too willing to bend the rules of the crown's trade policies. In 1451, the tide turned. Jacques was arrested, his assets seized. The charges against him were a mix of the political and the personal. Embezzlement, treason, and even sorcery were alleged. It is difficult now to separate fact from the deliberate machinations of rivals. What is clear is that he fell from the king's favor in spectacular fashion. Yet Jacques Coeur was not a man to be broken easily. After 3 years of imprisonment, he escaped, aided, it seems, by allies who still saw value in his skills. He traveled to Rome, and from there was sent by the Pope on a mission to the eastern Mediterranean. He died in 1456 far from Bourges, but his name remained linked to an age when a man born without noble title could build a fortune so vast and a network so wide that even kings had reason to take notice, and perhaps to fear him. From the market stalls to the royal treasury, his life was a reminder that the medieval city could produce not only craftsmen and laborers, but also figures whose reach and ambition outstripped the walls themselves. And yet, while Jacques Coeur's story is remarkable, it is only one thread in the great tapestry of the medieval world. Some threads we must search for, hidden, frayed, and sometimes almost invisible, in the shadows of libraries and the dust of archives, which brings us to our next journey, into the mystery of the lost medieval manuscripts. Imagine stepping into a dimly lit chamber, far from the noise of the marketplace. The air is cooler here, tinged with the dry, faintly sweet scent of parchment. Shelves rise on every side, crowded with volumes bound in leather or wrapped in cloth. A narrow window lets in a single blade of light, illuminating dust that drifts lazily in the stillness. This is a library, or perhaps more accurately, a treasury. For in the medieval world, books were treasures. They were not mass-produced objects, but singular creations, each the work of many hands over many months. A manuscript might contain the work of a poet, long dead, the treatise of a philosopher, or the carefully recorded annals of a monastery. And yet, so many of these works are gone. Some were destroyed in fires, their pages curling and blackening in moments. Others were lost to damp, the ink bleeding into unreadable stains. Still more were deliberately erased, the parchment scraped clean so that new words could be written over the old, a practice known as palimpsest. In an age when parchment was costly, the life of a text could be sacrificed to the needs of the present. You might think of the great libraries of the time, the Sorbonne in Paris, the monastic collections of Cluny, the universities of Bologna and Oxford. They housed hundreds, even thousands of volumes. Yet even their loss was inevitable. Political upheaval, war, and simple neglect all took their toll. One of the great mysteries is not just what was lost, but why certain texts disappeared more completely than others. Historians and archaeologists still uncover fragments in the most unexpected places. In the binding of a book, a sliver of older parchment might be found, reused for its sturdy texture. In the back of a cupboard in a rural church, a bundle of forgotten sermons might rest, untouched for centuries. There are stories of remarkable rediscoveries. In 1879, a German scholar named Konstantin von Tischendorf visited a monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. There, he found pages of an ancient Greek Bible being used to stoke fires, not out of malice, but because the monks had no sense of the rarity of the text in their possession. He rescued them, and in doing so, preserved one of the oldest copies of the Christian scriptures known today. In other cases, the loss was the result of more deliberate acts. During the Reformation in the 16th century, many monasteries across Europe were dissolved. Their libraries, rich with centuries of collected knowledge, were scattered. Some volumes were sold, others destroyed, and many simply vanished into private collections, where they remained hidden. Even now, in quiet archives and private estates, there are whispers of manuscripts unseen by the public. A codex in a family library, passed down quietly through generations. A medieval romance preserved in a chest, its existence known only to a handful of scholars. Each discovery reshapes our understanding of the medieval mind, its interests, its beliefs, its ways of recording the world. There is a certain serenity in thinking about these lost books. They are reminders of the fragility of knowledge, of how easily the voice of one age can be silenced in the next. Yet they also hint at endurance. For as much as has been lost, there is always the possibility of finding more. And so, as the candle burns low in our imagined library, you might picture a scribe, bent over a page, quill in hand, painstakingly copying the words that someone else once feared might be forgotten. Outside, the city still hums with life, but here, the pace is slower, the light softer, and the only sound is the steady scratch of pen on parchment. From these quiet, hidden rooms, we will return now to the open halls of power, where light glitters off silver goblets, and the air is heavy with the scent of roasted meats. It is time to step into a different world entirely. The noble banquet. Step now into the great hall of a noble household. The air is warmer here than in the streets, thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, beeswax candles, and food that has been cooking for hours. Above you, the timbered roof rises high into the shadows, beams darkened by decades of smoke from the central hearth. You have arrived before the banquet begins, while the hall is being prepared. The long trestle tables are set in rows, covered with linen cloths that have been carefully washed and folded. At the high end of the room, on a slightly raised platform, sits the top table reserved for the Lord, his family, and the most important guests. The placement here is not simply a matter of comfort. It is a statement of hierarchy. To dine close to the Lord is to be seen as a person of consequence. Servants move quietly, placing pewter plates, polished goblets, and knives with carved handles. Forks are rare. Most guests will eat with their fingers, assisted by small personal knives. Bowls of salt, precious enough to be kept under lock and key in many households, are set at intervals, a sign of wealth as much as a seasoning for the food. In the kitchen beyond, the work is unceasing. Large spits turn slowly over open flames, bearing joints of venison and whole birds stuffed with herbs. Pots simmer with thick stews, while loaves of bread are baked to accompany the meal. In a side chamber, pastries are being filled with spiced fruit, ready for the sweet course that will follow. As the guests begin to arrive, the hall fills with a gentle murmur of conversation, the rustle of heavy wool and fur-trimmed cloaks. The flicker of candlelight catches on gold rings and jeweled brooches. There is no rush. The banquet is as much about display as it is about eating, and part of the pleasure is in the slow unfolding of the evening. When the Lord enters, the room rises. He takes his place at the high table, and the feast begins in earnest. The first course might include delicate pottages, smooth, seasoned soups, served alongside small pies filled with minced meat. The richer dishes come later. Swan or peacock, served with their feathers arranged back into place for ornament. Platters of roasted boar, fish from the estate's ponds, poached and dressed with herbs. Wine flows freely, though watered to last through the evening, and ale is served in generous measures. Between courses, there is music, perhaps a harp or lute, and sometimes recitations of poetry. In some courts, acrobats or jesters perform, though here, the atmosphere is more measured, the entertainment chosen to flatter the Lord's refinement. For the guests seated farther from the high table, the fare is simpler. The bread may be coarser, the meat less choice. This, too, is part of the structure of the feast, a visual and tangible reinforcement of social order. Those near the Lord receive the finest, those at the edges make do with what is left. As the evening wears on, the pace slows. The final course, known as the issue, might include sweetmeats, candied nuts, and hippocras, a spiced wine served warm. It is a gentle close to the meal, a signal that the formal part of the gathering is ending. When the guests depart, the hall is quieter, but still carries the warmth of the evening. Candles gutter low in their holders. The tables now cleared, bear faint traces of the feast, a scattering of crumbs, the imprint of plates in the linen. The servants will be working late into the night, washing the vessels, banking the fire, and setting things in order for the next day. Outside, the city lies in darkness, the streets silent except for the occasional echo of footsteps. Within the hall, the last embers glow faintly, a reminder of the heat and brightness that filled the room just hours before. Let yourself get comfortable. Let your breathing slow to an easy, steady rhythm, like the slow current of a wide river. We are about to travel far back in time, more than 3,000 years, to a place where life was measured not by hours and minutes, but by the steady, unchanging cycle of the seasons. When you think of ancient Egypt, you might picture the pyramids rising above the desert, the solemn statues of pharaohs, or the glint of gold in the light of the sun. But for most Egyptians, life was lived far from palaces and temples. It was a life that followed the rhythm of the Nile, where survival depended on the river's rise and fall, and where the most important events were not grand coronations, but the first sprouting of wheat, the baking of bread, and the return of the annual flood. Tonight, we will walk quietly through that life, imagining the feel of sun-baked earth beneath bare feet, the sound of grinding stones shaping flour, the smell of bread baking in clay ovens. We will begin with the world of an ordinary farmer, one of the countless men and women whose work sustained the kingdom. From there, we will meet a boy who became king, a short-lived ruler who altered the course of Egypt's history. We will descend into the silence of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, where mysteries still lie sealed behind stone. And we will finish inside the palace of a pharaoh, among cool columns and gardens shaded from the heat. But for now, imagine yourself stepping out into the pale dawn light, with the Nile close at hand and the work of the day waiting for you. The first light comes gently in Egypt. Before the sun rises above the horizon, the air is cool and still. The mud brick walls of your home hold the night's coolness, and for a moment, the world is quiet except for the low murmur of voices as your family wakes. You sleep on a simple mat woven from reeds, rolled out on the floor each night and rolled away during the day. The smell of straw and earth lingers faintly in the air. You rise and pull on the same garment you wore yesterday, a short kilt made from pale linen, woven from flax grown nearby. It is light and breathable, though before long the sun will make the air heavy. Stepping outside, the land is soft with early shadows. The river is close. You can hear its faint, constant movement. The Nile is more than a source of water. It is the heartbeat of your world. Each year, its floodwaters bring a layer of rich black silt, fertile enough to grow the wheat and barley your village depends on. Your day's work depends on the season. In Akit, the season of inundation, the fields lie under shallow water. In Pare, the planting season, you walk barefoot through damp soil, scattering seeds by hand, covering them with a sweep of your foot. In Shemu, the harvest season, you cut the grain with a curved flint sickle, the sound of stalks falling soft and regular in the warm air. The work is steady, almost meditative, but the land also demands other tasks. Some mornings, you tend to animals, a small herd of goats or cattle, leading them to the greener banks along the river. On other days, you grind grain into flour using a stone quern, kneeling for hours with the rhythmic scrape of stone against stone. The flour is coarse and warm to the touch, and the work leaves a fine dust on your skin. The smell of baking bread drifts from nearby ovens, mingling with a tang of smoke from the cooking fires. The bread is made from EMR wheat, its crust baked hard, its center dense and filling. Beer, too, is made here in the village, thick, slightly sweet, and nourishing enough to be a meal in itself. The heat grows quickly. By midday, the sun stands high and the air shimmers above the fields. Flies gather, persistent and unbothered by swatting hands. You take shelter under a tree or beside the wall of your house, where the shadow is narrow but welcome. Cleanliness is not just a matter of comfort, but of ritual importance. In the heat of the day, you may walk to the river to wash, letting the cool water run over your arms and face. The river is both practical and sacred, a link between daily survival and the divine order. Evening comes with relief. The light softens, turning the water to gold. Children's laughter drifts through the air as they play near the houses. The day ends with a shared meal: bread, beer, onions, and perhaps a little fish, if the catch was good. When darkness comes, it is sudden. The stars emerge sharp and bright over the desert's edge. You lie again on your reed mat, the scent of the river still faint in the air, knowing that tomorrow will be much the same. A life shaped by the Nile, patient, steady, and enduring. In the long history of Egypt, pharaohs came and went, some ruling for decades, others for only a few fleeting years. One of the most famous of all, though not for his deeds during life, but for what was found after, was a boy who took the throne while still a child, and whose short reign quietly reshaped the kingdom. His name at birth was Tetan-Khatan, living image of Aten. He was born into a time of deep change. His likely father, Akhenaten, had overturned centuries of religious tradition, closing temples to Egypt's many gods and focusing worship on one, the Aten, the sun disk. This was more than a matter of faith. It disrupted the economic and political balance of the kingdom, severing the power of the old priesthoods and unsettling the lives of countless Egyptians whose rituals had always revolved around a complex pantheon. Tutankhaten's early years were spent in Akhenaten, the new capital his father had built in the desert. It was a bright city of wide streets and open courtyards, its temples without the dark, enclosed sanctuaries of the old ways. The art and inscriptions of the time show a softer, more intimate style, with the royal family depicted in moments of domestic life, shaded by the rays of the eight. But the boy's life was soon changed by death, his father's, perhaps also that of his mother, and by the political needs of the kingdom. At around 8 or 9 years old, he became pharaoh. Though crowned as ruler of the two lands, the real power lay with his senior advisors: Ai, an experienced courtier, and Horemheb, a respected general. It was during his reign, likely under the guidance of these men, that the great reversal began. The worship of Ammon and the other gods was restored. Temples that had been abandoned or defaced were repaired. Priests were reinstated, and festivals returned to the calendar. The capital shifted back to Thebes, the religious heart of the old order. To mark this restoration, the boy king changed his name from Tutankhaten, honoring the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammon. The name change was a public statement, signaling to all Egypt that the gods of their ancestors had been welcomed back into the center of their lives. Little else is recorded about his reign, which lasted perhaps 9 or 10 years. He may have participated in religious ceremonies, received foreign envoys, and lent his image to military campaigns. Though it was the generals who truly led the armies, his life would have been one of ceremony, ritual, and instruction. A young king learning to wear the crown while the affairs of state were managed around him. And then, suddenly, it ended. Tutankhamun died in his late teens. The cause remains uncertain, perhaps illness, an accident, or complications from physical ailments that scholars believe he may have carried from birth. His death left Egypt without an heir, and power passed quickly to his advisor. He was buried in a tomb far smaller than most pharaohs. It may have been intended for someone else, adapted at short notice, but the burial was rich: chariots, clothing, jewelry, furniture, weapons, and, most famously, the gold mask that still gazes calmly out from behind museum glass. For over 3,000 years, his name faded from memory. It was the discovery of his largely intact tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter that brought him into the modern imagination, not as a ruler of vast power, but as a symbol of Egypt's enduring splendor. If you think of him now, picture not just the glitter of gold, but the quiet image of a boy in pleated linen, standing small beneath the towering columns of a temple, learning the gestures of kingship, and stepping carefully between the weight of tradition and the demands of change. From the life of this young pharaoh, our path leads back to the earth itself, to the valleys where kings, queens, and nobles were laid to rest, and where mysteries still lie hidden beneath the sands. The Valley of the Kings is a place where silence feels almost physical. It lies beyond the fertile banks of the Nile, in the dry embrace of the Theban hills. The earth here is pale, fractured by heat, and the wind carries with it the fine dust of limestone. In the distance, the peaks rise sharply, their outlines softened only by the haze of sunlight. To the ancient Egyptians, this valley was sacred, a gateway to the west, the land of the setting sun, and the realm of the dead. For over 5 centuries during the New Kingdom, it was the burial place of pharaohs and high nobles, their tombs hidden deep in the rock to protect them from the dangers of time and theft. Walking here in your imagination, you pass openings in the cliffs that look like nothing more than small doorways or unremarkable cuts in the stone. But each one leads to a world beneath. Long corridors carved into the rock, leading to burial chambers, whose walls glow with painted scenes of gods, boats, and the stars of the night sky. Some tombs are famous Seti, Ramses II, and of course Tutankhamun. Others are more obscure, their owners uncertain, their decoration unfinished. A few were never used at all, their empty corridors a reminder of plans interrupted by death or political change. Even today, the valley keeps its secrets. One of the most intriguing questions surrounds Tutankhamun's tomb. Ground-penetrating radar scans have suggested the possibility of hidden chambers beyond its decorated walls. Some archaeologists have speculated that these might contain another royal burial, perhaps even that of Queen Nefertiti. Others are cautious, noting that geological irregularities could create similar readings. For now, the truth remains locked behind ancient plaster and stone. The valley has yielded other surprises in modern times. In 2005, archaeologists uncovered KV63, the first new tomb found in the valley since Tutankhamun's in 1922. It was not a burial, but a storage chamber, filled with coffins, jars, and materials related to mummification. Its discovery was a quiet reminder that the sands still have more to give. Tomb robbing was as old as the valley itself. Many chambers were entered in antiquity, their treasures removed, their occupants disturbed. Some were cleared officially in later periods to recover precious metals during times of hardship. Yet even in stripped tombs, the artistry of the walls, the shape of the chambers, and the fragments left behind still speak of the beliefs and ambitions of those who built them. Inside the tombs, the air is still and cool. The light of a modern lamp falls across vivid colors that have survived for thousands of years. Deep blues made from crushed minerals, warm reds from ochre, shining yellows from orpiment. Scenes show the pharaoh sailing on the solar bark, receiving the ank of life from the gods, or stepping into the embrace of Osiris. Outside, the valley changes with the sun. In the early morning, the shadows are long and the cliffs are pale. By midday, the heat is unyielding, the stone glaring white, and in the evening, the light turns gold, softening every surface. It is easy to picture, in that golden hour, the slow procession of a funeral, priests chanting prayers, mourners carrying offerings, the wrapped figure of a king, borne toward his final resting place. From these quiet, hidden chambers beneath the hills, life in Egypt could not feel more distant. Yet only a short walk away, the living world of the palace was alive with color, music, and the business of state. And that is where we turn next, to step inside a pharaoh's home. Step now from the silence of the desert into a place of color, light, and constant movement. The palace of a pharaoh. The change is immediate. The air is scented with incense, a mix of imported resins and local herbs. The sound of footsteps on polished floors replaces the crunch of gravel beneath sandals. Here, the world is shaped not by the cycles of planting and harvest, but by the rhythms of court life. The great audience hall is vast, its roof supported by painted columns shaped like bundles of papyrus. Sunlight filters through high openings, casting soft patterns on the stone floor. The walls are painted with scenes of abundance. The pharaoh offering to the gods, processions of servants carrying trays piled high with food, and the depiction of conquered lands bringing tribute. The pharaoh sits on a gilded throne inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stones, wearing the pleated linen robe and the striped Nenis headdress. At his sides stand fan-bearers, moving tall ostrich feather fans in slow, measured sweeps. Scribes stand nearby, ready to record decrees, lists of offerings, or the words of visiting dignitaries. Behind this formal space lie private chambers, storerooms, and lush enclosed gardens. In these gardens, pools of still water reflect the sky, while date palms and flowering shrubs offer shade from the midday heat. The sound of trickling water from stone basins softens the air, creating an oasis in the center of power. The palace is a center of administration. Scribes bring in papyrus scrolls marked with tallies of grain and taxes, accounts of trade expeditions, and reports from distant provinces. Messengers arrive with news from the frontiers, from Nubia in the south or from the Mediterranean coast. Decisions here ripple outward through the kingdom. In the kitchens, there is a different kind of activity. Cooks prepare food not just for the pharaoh, but for visiting nobles and officials. Loaves of bread are baked in large clay ovens, while fish and meat are seasoned with coriander, cumin, and fenugreek. Honey-sweetened pastries are laid out on trays, ready for the dessert course of a feast. When the pharaoh hosts a banquet, the halls glow with the light of oil lamps. Musicians play harps, lutes, and reed flutes, filling the air with slow, flowing melodies. Dancers move with graceful precision, their movements telling stories as old as the kingdom itself. Guests recline on low couches, dipping bread into bowls of stewed vegetables or roasted meats. Wine flows freely, poured from jars, decorated with painted lotus flowers. Even in these moments of leisure, the palace is a place of order. Who sits where, which dishes are served first, and the sequence of entertainment all carry symbolic meaning. Every detail reinforces the pharaoh's role as the axis on which the kingdom turns. As night deepens, the music softens and the guests begin to depart. The air in the gardens cools, carrying the faint scent of night-blooming flowers. In the still pools, the moon shimmers, broken only by the gentle ripple of a fish beneath the surface. At last, the palace grows quiet. Servants move through the halls, extinguishing lamps, their soft footsteps echoing in the vast spaces. The pharaoh retires to private chambers, and outside the city of Thebes sleeps under the same stars that shine over the farmers' fields far downstream. Find a comfortable position, let your shoulders ease down, and allow your breath to slow. We are going to travel back to the 19th century, to a time when Britain's cities were growing at a speed they had never known before. Factories churned out goods for a hungry empire. The railways stitched together countryside and coast, and the great ports brimmed with ships from every corner of the world. But behind this image of progress lay another reality. Away from the clean boulevards and fine townhouses, in cramped courts and narrow lanes, the urban poor made their lives in the shadow of industry. These were the Victorian slums, districts where overcrowding was common, where coal smoke clung to every surface, and where survival depended on unending labor, the charity of others, or sheer luck. Tonight, we will walk quietly through this world. We will begin in the morning streets of a crowded neighborhood, among the markets, the small workshops, and the maze of lodgings where hundreds shared a single pump for water. From there, we will meet a woman whose name became a symbol of compassion, Florence Nightingale, and follow her from drawing rooms to hospital wards. We will pause to explore the mystery of the vanished workhouses, and what their remains tell us about the lives inside them. And we will end far from the smoke, at a country estate where the wealthy enjoyed weekends of leisure that could not have been more different from life in the slum. But first, imagine stepping into the pale morning light of a narrow street. The cobbles slick from overnight rain, and the day just beginning to stir. The air is damp, carrying the sharp scent of coal smoke. It catches in your throat before you've even walked to the end of the lane. The rows of houses rise on either side, narrow brick-fronted, their windows clouded with condensation from within. Between them, passageways barely wide enough for two people to pass snake deeper into the warren of the neighborhood. You live in a single room, perhaps with 5 or 6 others. The space is small enough that the bed takes up half of it, and in the colder months, every breath clouds the air. Clothes hang from nails in the wall, drying slowly over the small stove in the corner. The floor is bare boards, worn smooth by countless feet. Outside, the street is already busy. Children with pale faces and unbrushed hair run errands for a penny, their boots too large, their coats thin. Women carry buckets to the shared water pump, the iron handle wet and cold to the touch. Some balance baskets of laundry for the wash house, where the steam rises thick and white into the morning air. The smell of the street is a mixture you soon stop noticing. Coal smoke, damp brick, cabbage boiled the night before, and the faint sourness from the open privy at the end of the court. The privy is shared by dozens of people. It is emptied irregularly, and when it overflows, the waste runs down into the gutter between the cobbles. Work is rarely far from home. In the small rooms above the street, families do piecework, sewing shirts, stitching boots, rolling cigarettes, paid by the dozen, the pay barely enough to cover rent. The light is poor, especially in winter, and the air is heavy from the close press of bodies and the dust of fabric or leather. Some go to the factories or docks at dawn, walking through the drizzle toward the taller chimneys at the city's edge. Others hawk goods in the street, bundles of firewood, matches, scraps of food. Children work too, carrying deliveries, minding younger siblings, or spending long hours in mills where the air is thick with fiber dust. By midday, the narrow lanes feel crowded. Costermongers set up barrows piled with vegetables, their voices calling above the rumble of cartwheels. The cheapest cuts of meat hang in butchers' windows, their color dark in the low light. Fishmongers shout their prices for sprats and mackerel, the smell sharp enough to carry far down the street. There are places to find food for little or nothing. The soup kitchen run by a nearby mission ladles out bowls of thin broth and bread, the queue stretching into the street. Inside, the air is warm, though the walls are bare, and the soup is served quickly to keep the line moving. As evening falls, lamps are lit, some in windows, some fixed to the wall at the corner of the street. Their glow is weak, leaving the center of the lane in shadow. In many rooms, the day's work continues under the flicker of candles. The last stitch is finished before the bundle is taken to the warehouse for payment. By night, the sounds change. A distant piano from a public house, the call of a street seller still walking his route, the rattle of a cart over cobbles. Inside the lodging houses, people crowd into shared beds or curl up by the stove, the air close and warm. In the slum, life is a constant negotiation with discomfort, damp, smoke, noise, and the press of too many people in too little space. But it is also a place of endurance, where the rhythm of each day repeats, binding the community together in the shared work of getting through to the next morning. Far from the crowded lanes of the slums, another world existed in Victorian Britain, one of well-kept gardens, large drawing rooms, and the quiet comfort of wealth. It was into this world that Florence Nightingale was born, in the spring of 1820, in the city of Florence, Italy, from which she took her name. Her parents were part of the prosperous upper class, and her childhood was one of education, travel, and opportunity. From an early age, Florence was unusually serious in her thinking. She was taught languages, mathematics, and philosophy, but it was her sense of purpose that set her apart. By her late teens, she felt she had a calling, a conviction that her life should be dedicated to helping others. In the polite society she inhabited, this idea was unconventional, even unwelcome. Nursing was not a profession for a well-bred young woman. It was considered menial, rough work, done in poor conditions by those with little choice. Yet Florence's determination did not fade. In 1851, she trained at a Protestant hospital in Germany, studying methods of patient care and hospital management. Her approach was methodical. She valued cleanliness, order, and a systematic way of organizing care that was rare at the time. Her moment of lasting fame came during the Crimean War, which broke out in 1853. Reports reached Britain of appalling conditions in military hospitals, overcrowding, lack of supplies, and high death rates from disease. In 1854, Florence was asked to lead a team of nurses to the Scutari Barracks Hospital near Constantinople. When she arrived, the scene was grim. Wards were overcrowded, sanitation was poor, and disease spread quickly among the wounded. Florence applied the principles she had studied, improving hygiene, organizing supplies, and keeping careful records. These changes reduced death rates significantly. It was during these long nights in the wards that she earned the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life: the Lady with the Lamp. Soldiers spoke of seeing her move quietly from bed to bed after dark, a small oil lamp in her hand, checking on each patient. The image was simple, but it captured the public's imagination back in Britain. After the war, Florence did not seek to rest on her reputation. She used her influence to push for reform in both military and civilian hospitals, writing extensively on sanitation, nursing education, and the importance of statistical analysis in public health. Her careful charts and reports were instrumental in convincing governments and institutions to adopt cleaner, safer practices. Despite ill health in later life, she continued to write and advise on nursing and hospital design. By the time of her death in 1910, she had transformed nursing from an undervalued role into a respected profession, and her name had become a symbol of compassion joined with discipline. It is easy to picture her now in the quiet of a dimly lit ward, the steady glow of the lamp casting soft light on rows of sleeping patients, her footsteps quiet against the stone floor, her presence a reassurance in the long hours before dawn. From her story, we turn to another kind of institution in Victorian Britain, one that was far less remembered for kindness, and whose physical traces have often faded from the landscape: the workhouse. In the 19th century, the workhouse was a feature of almost every town and city in Britain. These institutions were created under the poor law system to provide shelter and sustenance for those unable to support themselves: the elderly, the sick, the unemployed, and orphaned children. But the help they offered came at a cost. Life inside was meant to be austere, deliberately discouraging all but the most desperate from seeking relief. A workhouse was typically a large brick-built complex, often set back from the main street. High walls surrounded it, and gates opened onto a yard that led to separate entrances for men, women, and children. Inside, the residents were divided according to age, health, and gender. Each group housed in its own ward or dormitory. The routine was strict. Days began early, with a bell calling everyone to rise. Meals were plain: bread, porridge, soup, perhaps a small portion of meat once or twice a week. In return, residents worked, breaking stones, picking oakum from old ropes, scrubbing floors, or sewing garments. Over time, many of these buildings fell into disuse. Some were converted into hospitals or schools. Others demolished entirely as social reforms and changes in welfare policy made them obsolete. In some towns, their locations are remembered in street names: Workhouse Lane or Union Road, but the structures themselves are gone, leaving little visible trace of the thousands who passed through their doors. Archaeologists and local historians have, in recent decades, tried to rediscover these sites. Excavations sometimes reveal the outlines of the old yards and dormitories. In the soil, small personal items emerge: a clay pipe, a worn shoe, a button from a child's jacket, fragments of crockery stamped with the workhouse's initials. These objects speak quietly of the people who once used them, offering small glimpses into lives otherwise recorded only in official registers. In some places, the main building still stands, repurposed into flats, offices, or community centers. The exterior might remain almost unchanged: tall sash windows, a central doorway, but the interior no longer holds the echo of boots in a tiled corridor, or the faint smell of boiled cabbage in the dining hall. The mystery of the lost workhouses is not always about their physical disappearance. It is also about the fading of their stories. For many years, the stigma attached to having lived in a workhouse meant that families rarely spoke of it. Generations later, descendants may not know that their grandparents or great-grandparents once crossed those gates. Standing at a former workhouse site today, you might see nothing but an empty lot, or a modern building with no visible sign of its past. Yet beneath the surface, both in the ground and in the historical record, traces remain. In old maps, in faded photographs, and in the memories preserved in diaries and letters, the workhouse is not entirely gone. From these hidden histories, we step now into a different kind of Victorian world, one where space, comfort, and beauty were abundant, and where leisure was as carefully arranged as the gardens themselves. the weekend retreat of a country house. Far from the smoke-filled air and narrow streets of the city, the countryside opens in long sweeps of green fields, hedgerows and tree-lined drives. At the end of one such drive stands a great country house, its stone facade bright in the sunlight, its windows tall and symmetrical. Here, in the last decades of the 19th century, the upper classes entertained themselves in a style that was part tradition, part performance. A weekend visit to such a house began with arrival by train or carriage. Guests, often carrying only small luggage, the rest having been sent ahead, were met at the door by liveried footmen. Inside, the entrance hall was a statement of status. Polished floors, mounted antlers or paintings, and a wide staircase rising to the upper floors. Guest rooms were large, with high ceilings, a fire already laid in the grate and fresh water in a porcelain jug on the washstand. On the bed lay a neatly folded towel and perhaps a small vase of flowers from the garden. Servants would unpack the luggage, pressing and arranging clothing in wardrobes and drawers. The weekend followed a rhythm designed for both comfort and display. Mornings might begin with a hearty breakfast in the dining room. Eggs, kippers, toast, tea, served at a long table under the light of a chandelier. Conversation was unhurried, and guests drifted away to their chosen activities, shooting parties in the fields, riding or walking through landscaped gardens. The gardens were themselves a point of pride, with carefully trimmed lawns, formal flower beds, and winding paths leading to ornamental lakes or follies. Strolling through them, guests might pause at a stone bench or a greenhouse filled with exotic plants, the glass warm from the sun. Afternoons often included sports or games, lawn tennis, croquet, or billiards indoors, if the weather turned. Those not playing might sit on the terrace, watching and talking, with tea and small sandwiches served on silver trays. Evenings were the centerpiece of the visit. Guests dressed formally for dinner, the men in black evening coats, the women in gowns of silk or satin. In the drawing room, they gathered before the meal, standing in small groups, glasses of sherry or champagne in hand. When dinner was announced, they moved into the dining room, where the table was set with silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and an array of candles casting a warm glow. The meal itself was served in courses: soup, fish, meat, game, puddings, and finally dessert. Between courses, conversation turned to politics, travel, or the latest events in London society. Servants moved quietly around the room, refilling glasses and replacing plates. After dinner, the guests returned to the drawing room. The evening might end with music. A piano played softly, or someone singing, or with games such as charades. For those inclined, the smoking room offered cigars and brandy, the air thick with fragrant smoke. When the guests retired, their rooms were lit by oil lamps or candles, the bed turned down, the fire burning low. Outside, the countryside lay in deep quiet, broken only by the faint hoot of an owl or the sound of wind in the trees. The weekend would end on Monday morning, with carriages or motor cars taking the guests back to the railway station. For them, it was a brief interlude of comfort and sociability, a world away from the crowded, smoky streets where so many Victorians lived their entire lives. Settle in and let your thoughts drift back, far back, to a small but famously formidable city-state on the rocky peninsula of ancient Greece. The land is dry here, the soil thin, and the mountains rise in hazy blue ridges against a wide sky. The air is warm, carrying the faint resinous scent of pine from the hills, and the dry sweetness of sun-baked earth. This is Sparta, a name you already know, perhaps from tales of warriors and battlefield glory. But tonight, we are not chasing the clash of spears or the rush of charging hoplites. We are moving slowly, quietly, through the daily rhythm of Spartan life, the real Spartan life, which was far more than its battlefield legend. The stories of this place are heavy with discipline and deprivation. Here, life from childhood was shaped by rules older than your grandfather's grandfather, rules designed to harden the body, steel the will, and leave no space for softness. But there was also a deep structure to this life, an order that, in its own way, provided comfort and certainty, even as it demanded endurance. Over the course of this journey, you'll step into the sandals of a Spartan child, feel the weight of their training, follow a king to the narrow pass at Thermopylae, peer past the legends into the truths archaeology reveals, and finally, sit in quiet observation as the city's elite debate the fate of its people. Our first step takes us into the most unyielding part of this society, the daily life that began not in adulthood, but in childhood, and was shaped to mold every Spartan into a soldier. Imagine you are 7 years old. The sun is just rising over the Taygetus mountains, and the cool of morning lingers in the shadows. Today is not a day to spend with your family. That ended yesterday. You've been taken from your home, from the warmth of your mother's arms, to begin a new life in the Agoj, the state-run system that will train you to be a warrior. Your bed here is not the soft pile of blankets you knew, but a pallet of reeds or straw, laid directly on the ground. A thin wool cloak is all you have for warmth, and it is yours for the entire year, no matter the season. If it tears, you will mend it. If it wears thin, you will endure it. Meals are simple and deliberately sparse. You eat what is given: coarse barley bread, a thin broth, sometimes the infamous black soup made from boiled pork, blood, and vinegar. It is not meant to delight the tongue. It is meant to fill the belly just enough to keep you strong. Hunger is expected here. In fact, you may be encouraged to steal extra food, not for the sake of eating well, but to practice cunning. If you are caught, you are punished, not for the theft, but for failing to be clever enough to avoid detection. The day is long and filled with training. At first, it is games and drills, running barefoot over rough ground, wrestling in the dust, learning to throw the javelin and carry a heavy shield. But these are games with a purpose, to build your body into something unyielding. As you grow older, the training grows harsher. You are taught to speak briefly and precisely, a habit that would one day be called laconic after the region itself. Discipline is constant. The pedonomos, the overseer, watches everything. If your posture slouches, you are corrected. If your voice wavers, you are told to stand taller, speak firmer. You learn to bear pain in silence. On cold nights, you are not given more blankets. You are told to move, to generate your own warmth. Life in the Agoj is not entirely without companionship. You are surrounded by boys your own age, sharing in the same trials, sleeping side by side, training together. Bonds form here, bonds that will carry on to the battlefield. Older youths mentor the younger, passing down lessons in survival, combat, and the art of living with less. Even in moments of rest, the atmosphere is purposeful. Songs and chants are taught, not for entertainment, but to strengthen the voice, keep rhythm in marching, and remember the deeds of those who came before. There is no real privacy, no indulgence in soft things, no comfort except that which comes from your own endurance. The goal is not to break you, but to shape you into someone who can face hardship without hesitation. And so, each day in the Agoj is another stone laid in the unshakable wall of the Spartan army. From this harsh, unyielding training ground, our journey will next follow one Spartan, a man whose name still echoes through history, as he walks toward his fate at a narrow pass where the mountains meet the sea. The man we now turn to is both a historical figure and a legend. His name, Leonidas, means son of the lion. He was not born to be king. In the Spartan system, even kings were subject to its rules, and his early years were shaped by the same Agoj that you have just imagined yourself enduring. Leonidas was the third son of a reigning king. In most other lands, that position would have meant a life outside the spotlight, perhaps even away from politics altogether. But Sparta was different. All boys, noble or not, were shaped in the same mold, trained to fight, to endure, to serve the state above all. His youth was likely marked by the same lean meals, cold nights, and long days of training you have just walked through. But Leonidas had one advantage. He was part of a royal lineage that carried with it the expectation of leadership. His elders would have taught him not only the arts of war, but also the skills of command, the measured way to speak in council, the patience to listen before deciding. Years passed, and fate moved unexpectedly. His older brothers did not take the throne for long, and when one died without an heir, Leonidas, now a seasoned man, found himself chosen as one of Sparta's 2 kings. This was not a role of unchecked power. In the Spartan system, the kings were bound by the will of the Gerousia, the council of elders, and by the customs of the land. But it was a role that carried immense responsibility, especially in times of war. The war that came would be unlike any other. Across the Aegean, the Persian Empire, vast, wealthy, and relentless, had already clashed with the Greek city-states when they returned to conquer Greece fully. They brought an army so large that ancient sources describe it in numbers that may be more poetic than precise. but still convey its immensity. In 480 BCE, the Persian king Xerxes sought to march his forces through central Greece. The Greek allies chose a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae as the place to make a stand. Its geography was perfect for defense: steep mountains on one side, the sea on the other, and a road so tight that only a few soldiers could pass abreast. Leonidas led a small allied force, including his now famous 300 Spartans, each accompanied by a number of lightly armed attendants. These were not inexperienced youths, they were men in their prime, each with a son old enough to carry on his name. In Spartan culture, this was a signal that they were prepared, even willing, not to return. The days at Thermopylae were a test of discipline and endurance. The Persians attacked in waves, but the Greeks held the narrow pass, their heavy armor and disciplined formation blunting the enemy's advantage in numbers. Leonidas stood among his men, not behind them. In the pauses between fighting, one can imagine the measured exchanges, short, precise orders, quiet encouragements, the kind of leadership that does not raise the voice but still carries weight. Eventually, the pass was betrayed. A local man revealed to Xerxes a mountain path that would allow the Persians to outflank the defenders. When Leonidas learned this, he dismissed most of the allied troops, keeping only his Spartans, the Thespians who chose to stay, and a small contingent of Thebans. The final stand was not a sudden, desperate collapse, but a deliberate act of resistance. The Spartans and their allies fought in the shadow of inevitable defeat, buying time for the rest of Greece to prepare. Leonidas fell in that battle, as did most of his companions, their bodies left in the dust of the pass until later recovered and honored. In death, Leonidas became more than a king. He became the embodiment of the Spartan ideal, steadfast, unyielding, devoted to the state above himself. His story would be told and retold, growing in the telling, until it became almost inseparable from the myth of Sparta itself. From the heat and dust of Thermopylae, our path now turns away from the battlefield, into quieter places, into the realm of historians and archaeologists, who sift through soil and text to uncover what was real and what was a carefully crafted image. This is the world of the Spartan mirage, the Sparta that lives in our imagination, of perfectly disciplined warriors, of a society without weakness or dissent, is partly a product of careful storytelling. Much of what we think we know comes from outsiders, especially Athens, Sparta's great rival, and from later historians who wrote long after the events they described. This layered mixture of fact and image is what scholars call the Spartan mirage. Imagine walking through the remains of Sparta today. You will not find the towering ruins of marble temples that Athens left behind, nor sprawling theaters or grand colonnades. Instead, there are scattered stones, low walls, and the faint outlines of buildings long returned to the earth. For centuries, Sparta's strength lay not in monuments but in the discipline of its people, and in the stories others told about them. The image of the Spartan warrior was shaped as much by politics as by reality. To allies, it was a reassuring symbol. Here were men who would hold the line, who would not waver, who placed the needs of the state above personal comfort. To enemies, it was a warning, and to Sparta itself, it became a tool of identity, a mirror they held up to themselves to encourage the virtues they valued. Yet archaeology paints a more nuanced picture. Excavations have revealed that Spartans did, in fact, have art, music, and luxuries, at least in certain contexts. Painted pottery, intricate bronze work, and fine textiles have been uncovered. This suggests that while the public image was one of austerity, private life may have been more comfortable, especially for the elite. There is also the question of the helots, the enslaved population that worked the land so that the Spartan warriors could train full-time. The mirage often omits the constant tension between Spartans and helots, a tension so great that periodic state-sanctioned killings were reported by ancient sources as a way to keep the helot population in check. In a city celebrated for equality among its citizens, this dependence on an oppressed majority was a sharp contradiction. One fascinating archaeological discovery comes from the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, a religious site where young Spartan boys underwent tests of endurance. As part of their training, among the finds are masks, small offerings, and evidence of large gatherings, suggesting that even the harshest rituals were woven into festivals that reinforced community identity. Here, the line between training and performance blurred. Discipline became spectacle. Historians debate how much of the Spartan way of life was truly unique. Other Greek states also valued military skill, trained their youth, and had strict codes of conduct. But Sparta's choice to define itself so completely by this identity, and to maintain it over centuries, was unusual. Some scholars argue that this rigid focus contributed to their eventual decline, leaving them less adaptable when the world around them changed. The Spartan mirage remains powerful because it is simple, and simple stories are easy to carry across time. We picture the red cloaks, the bronze shields, the unwavering lines of warriors at attention. But beneath the surface, Sparta was a complex society, balancing military discipline with religious festivals, political debate, and the practical needs of daily survival. As we step away from these blurred images of fact and legend, our next path leads not into the dusty fields or the quiet ruins, but into the high halls of power, to the Spartan council, where decisions about law and war were made, often in measured tones that could change the fate of the state. If you imagine Sparta only as a camp of soldiers, you miss the quieter spaces where its fate was truly decided. These were the meeting places of the Gerousia, the council of elders, and the two kings. Here, behind closed doors, away from the dust of the training grounds and the clang of the armory, the direction of the Spartan state was set. The Gerousia was made up of 28 men over the age of 60, chosen for life, along with the two kings. To reach this chamber, a man had to have not only lived a full life, but to have proven himself in war, in discipline, and in loyalty to the state. 60 was not a youthful age in the ancient world. It meant survival through campaigns, seasons of famine, and years of service, a testament to endurance. Picture them gathered in a dim hall, the air smelling faintly of olive oil from the lamps, the walls plain, without the decorative flourish you might expect in Athens or Corinth. The focus here was not on art, but on order. Elders sat in a semicircle, the kings in their appointed seats, while matters of war, foreign alliances, and law were presented and debated. The tone of these debates would not have been fiery or theatrical. In keeping with Spartan culture, speech was valued for its brevity and clarity. This was the origin of the word laconic, meaning short and to the point. A well-crafted sentence here might be no more than a few words, but it could carry the weight of law. The council's influence extended to deciding when Sparta would go to war, negotiating treaties, and even judging serious crimes. They could overrule the kings, and their collective decision was final. This balance between royal authority and elder wisdom was one of the ways Sparta maintained stability over centuries. Yet the council was not the only body of governance. The ephor's 5 officials elected annually acted as overseers, ensuring that the laws were upheld and the kings themselves did not overstep. These ephors could call the kings to account, a reminder that in Sparta even the highest leaders were servants of the state. From the outside, this system might seem rigid, but within it lay a quiet adaptability. When the Persian threat loomed, the council and kings worked together to send Leonidas to Thermopylae. When internal tensions rose, they turned to measures that were as much about preserving unity as about enforcing discipline. While much of Spartan life was lived in the open, in the barracks, on the training fields, at religious festivals, the council's work was deliberately secluded. Here, the noise of the city faded, replaced by the low murmur of elder voices and the careful weighing of words. It was a different kind of endurance, not of body, but of patience and perspective. From these measured councils to the harsh training grounds, from the myths that have survived to the realities buried beneath them, Sparta was more than its soldiers. It was a society built on a balance of power, belief, and image, a balance that kept it strong for centuries, and whose echoes still reach us today. Settle yourself into a comfortable position. Let the modern world drift into the background for a while. The hum of distant traffic, the glow of electric lights, the comfort of a warm room. All of these belong to now. But in a moment, we'll step quietly into then, into the vast, sprawling world of ancient Rome. Not the Rome of triumphal parades or shining marble temples that poets loved to describe, but a Rome lived in by millions, and among them, countless men, women, and children whose lives were not their own. Tonight, we will move slowly, gently, through their world. The sounds they heard, the work they did, the walls they lived within. We'll walk the quiet corridors of the powerful, where orders were given, and the noisy workshops where hands worked without pause. We'll feel the textures of rough linen tunics, hear the creak of wooden carts, smell the faint tang of olive oil and wood smoke, And as we wander through this world, you may find your mind beginning to drift. That's all right. You are not here to strain to remember every fact. You are here to float along, to let the rhythm of the past ease you towards rest. We'll begin, as always, not with grand events or famous names, but with the rhythm of daily life, with the people whose hours were filled from sunrise to sunset with labor, the enslaved of Rome. Imagine you wake, not in your own bed, but on a simple pallet of straw, the faint smell of dust rising with each movement. The light in the small, cramped room is dim, only the pale blue-gray of the early dawn slipping in through a narrow gap in the shutters. You are not woken by choice. In the household, work begins before the city itself stirs. A fellow servant nudges you. The overseer will expect you on your feet quickly. Your tunic is plain and worn, woven from coarse linen, its fibers rough against your skin. If you serve in a city home, your first steps take you along the stone corridor toward the kitchen. The air there is cool at this hour, but already carrying a hint of the day's tasks, the yeasty warmth of bread dough rising, the sharper scent of garlic being crushed in a mortar. Clay amphorae stand against the wall, sealed with wax, holding oil and wine. A pot of water, drawn from the household cistern, is set to heat over the coals. Your duties may be in cooking, cleaning, tending the children, or assisting your master in his public business. The tasks change with the seasons, with the household's needs, with the mood of those in charge. If you serve in the countryside, the rhythm is different. You step into the dawn mist of the fields, where the land smells of damp earth and cut grass. Your hands will work the plow, drive the mules, prune the vines, or gather olives. In both city and country, there is a sameness to the hours. You are told where to go and what to do. The work is unending, though not all slaves suffer the same way. A skilled artisan, owned by a wealthy patron, might work at a lathe, carving delicate furniture legs, or shaping bronze fittings. A household tutor might teach children Greek and Latin, enjoying relative comfort, though never freedom. Others labor in the heat, carrying amphorae from ships in the harbor, their bare feet slapping against worn wooden planks. The overseer, a villicus on an estate, or a dispensator in a household, keeps the account of hours worked, goods produced, and rules obeyed. Punishment for mistakes or disobedience could be swift, though rarely in the form the modern imagination conjures. It might be extra duties, loss of food rations, or confinement in a storage space until the master's temper cooled. The shadow of harsher consequences always lingered. Food is plain but sustaining. Bread made from coarse flour, perhaps dipped in wine, a handful of olives, a bowl of thin vegetable stew. In the fields, the midday meal might be taken under a patch of shade, a fig tree, or the shelter of a storage shed, before returning to work. In the city, you might snatch a mouthful standing by the kitchen wall before hurrying back to your post. Yet there are moments, rare though they may be, of quiet. Standing on a villa's balcony in the late afternoon, when the light is golden and the streets below are just beginning to fill with merchants and customers. Sitting on the edge of a vineyard row, listening to the soft wind ruffle the leaves. And always, there is the thought, faint, perhaps unspoken, that one day, freedom might be possible. Manumission, the formal release from slavery, could come as a reward for long service, for loyalty, or through purchase of one's own freedom if enough coin could be saved. But for most, it was a hope as distant as the horizon. The day ends as it began, not with choice, but with duty. Tools cleaned and stored, floors swept, lamps trimmed for the night. The household quiets, save for the occasional murmur of voices or the barking of a dog in the street. You return to your pallet, the rough fabric under your cheek, the smell of oil smoke in the air, and the knowledge that tomorrow will be much the same. Now, let us drift from the everyday rhythm of countless anonymous lives to the story of one man, a name that has traveled through centuries, carried in whispers and in legend. Spartacus. Even in his own time, details about him were not widely known. What we believe is shaped by fragments, Roman historians, each with their own perspective, and the occasional inscription or artifact. We think he was born in Thrace, a rugged land of hills, forests, and hardy people to the north of Greece. Thracians were known as fierce warriors, skilled with spear and sword, and often drawn into the service of larger powers. At some point, Spartacus came into Roman hands, perhaps captured in battle, perhaps betrayed. Enslavement in Rome was not a matter of race or ethnicity. It was often a matter of misfortune, of being on the wrong side of war or politics. For Spartacus, This misfortune would lead him to the gladiatorial school at Capua, one of several cities in Italy known for training fighters for the arena. The ludus, as such a school was called, was not a place of choice. Its walls were high, its gates secure. Inside, men trained not for war in the field, but for the spectacle of the amphitheater. They learned the weight and balance of different weapons, the curved sickle sword, the long spear, the short gladius. They practiced footwork on sand, learned to anticipate the movements of an opponent, and conditioned their bodies to endure blows. Life in the ludus was harsh. Food was given in quantity, for muscle was needed, but freedom was absent. Discipline was constant, and the days were measured by the sun's movement across the yard and the call of the trainers. The knowledge that every contest in the arena could be one's last was a constant shadow. Yet Spartacus, along with a group of fellow gladiators, found within those walls the will to resist. In the year 73 BCE, they broke free, not with grand plans at first, but with the urgency of escape. Their initial weapons were kitchen knives and spit rods taken from the training school's cooking area. They fought their way out, seized proper arms from a wagon of gladiatorial equipment, and fled into the countryside. From there, the story expanded beyond what Rome could have imagined. Spartacus and his companions drew to them others, slaves from farms and estates, shepherds and herders, even some free men with grievances against the state. What began as a handful became hundreds, then thousands. They moved through the Italian countryside, living off the land, evading or defeating the small forces sent against them. Spartacus is remembered not simply as a fighter, but as a leader. Ancient sources speak of his discipline, that he tried to restrain the worst impulses of the growing rebel force, forbidding pointless cruelty, maintaining order among people who had known only hardship and subjugation. For nearly 2 years, Rome struggled to suppress the rebellion. Spartacus led his followers from the south of Italy toward the Alps, perhaps intending to disperse and let each find their way to freedom. But circumstances and the tightening net of Roman armies brought the great confrontation. In 71 BCE, the forces of Marcus Licinius Crassus trapped the rebels in southern Italy. The final battle was fierce. Accounts say Spartacus fought at the front, seeking out Crassus himself in the crush of combat. When he fell, his body was never recovered, perhaps lost among the many on the field. Rome punished the survivors harshly, but the name Spartacus endured, not as Rome remembered him, an enemy of the state, but as later generations would recast him, a symbol of resistance against oppression. And yet, as you consider his story, it is important to remember the countless others whose names have vanished entirely. Spartacus was exceptional, but his life began in the same constraints, the same limitations, as millions of others in Rome's vast slave system. From here, our steps will take us into the quieter realm of things hidden, the traces left in earth and ash, the silent stories of those who never led armies or stood in the arena, but whose work and presence are etched into history in unexpected ways. In the 19th century, the workhouse was a feature of almost every town and city in Britain. These institutions were created under the poor law system to provide shelter and sustenance for those unable to support themselves, the elderly, the sick, the unemployed, and orphaned children. But the help they offered came at a cost. Life inside was meant to be austere, deliberately discouraging all but the most desperate from seeking relief. A workhouse was typically a large brick-built complex, often set back from the main street. High walls surrounded it, and gates opened onto a yard that led to separate entrances for men, women, and children. Inside, the residents were divided according to age, health, and gender, each group housed in its own ward or dormitory. The routine was strict. Days began early, with a bell calling everyone to rise. Meals were plain: bread, porridge, soup, perhaps a small portion of meat once or twice a week. In return, residents worked, breaking stones, picking oakum from old ropes, scrubbing floors, or sewing garments. Over time, many of these buildings fell into disuse. Some were converted into hospitals or schools. Others demolished entirely as social reforms and changes in welfare policy made them obsolete. In some towns, their locations are remembered in street names, Workhouse Lane or Union Road, but the structures themselves are gone, leaving little visible trace of the thousands who passed through their doors. Archaeologists and local historians have, in recent decades, tried to rediscover these sites. Excavations sometimes reveal the outlines of the old yards and dormitories. In the soil, small personal items emerge: a clay pipe, a worn shoe, a button from a child's jacket, fragments of crockery stamped with the workhouse's initials. These objects speak quietly of the people who once used them, offering small glimpses into lives otherwise recorded only in official registers. In some places, the main building still stands, repurposed into flats, offices, or community centers. The exterior might remain almost unchanged, tall sash windows, a central doorway, but the interior no longer holds the echo of boots in a tiled corridor, or the faint smell of boiled cabbage in the dining hall. The mystery of the lost workhouses is not always about their physical disappearance. It is also about the fading of their stories. For many years, the stigma attached to having lived in a workhouse meant that families rarely spoke of it. Generations later, descendants may not know that their grandparents or great-grandparents once crossed those gates. Standing at a former workhouse site today, you might see nothing but an empty lot, or a modern building with no visible sign of its past. Yet beneath the surface, both in the ground and in the historical record, traces remain. In old maps, in faded photographs, and in the memories preserved in diaries and letters, the workhouse is not entirely gone. From these hidden histories, we step now into a different kind of Victorian world, one where space, comfort, and beauty were abundant, and where leisure was as carefully arranged as the gardens themselves. The weekend retreat of a country house. Far from the smoke-filled air and narrow streets of the city, the countryside opens in long sweeps of green fields, hedgerows, and tree-lined drives. At the end of one such drive stands a great country house, its stone facade bright in the sunlight, its windows tall and symmetrical. Here, in the last decades of the 19th century, the upper classes entertained themselves in a style that was part tradition, part performance. A weekend visit to such a house began with arrival by train or carriage. Guests, often carrying only small luggage, the rest having been sent ahead, were met at the door by liveried footmen. Inside, the entrance hall was a statement of status. Polished floors, mounted antlers or paintings, and a wide staircase rising to the upper floors. Guest rooms were large, with high ceilings, a fire already laid in the grate, and fresh water in a porcelain jug on the washstand. On the bed lay a neatly folded towel and perhaps a small vase of flowers from the garden. Servants would unpack the luggage, pressing and arranging clothing in wardrobes and drawers. The weekend followed a rhythm designed for both comfort and display. Mornings might begin with a hearty breakfast in the dining room. Eggs, kippers, toast, tea, served at a long table under the light of a chandelier. Conversation was unhurried, and guests drifted away to their chosen activities. Shooting parties in the fields, riding or walking through landscaped gardens. The gardens were themselves a point of pride, with carefully trimmed lawns, formal flower beds, and winding paths leading to ornamental lakes or follies. Strolling through them, guests might pause at a stone bench or a greenhouse filled with exotic plants, the glass warm from the sun. Afternoons often included sports or games, lawn tennis, croquet, or billiards indoors, if the weather turned. Those not playing might sit on the terrace, watching and talking, with tea and small sandwiches served on silver trays. Evenings were the centerpiece of the visit. Guests dressed formally for dinner, the men in black evening coats, the women in gowns of silk or satin. In the drawing room, they gathered before the meal, standing in small groups, glasses of sherry or champagne in hand. When dinner was announced, they moved into the dining room, where the table was set with silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and an array of candles casting a warm glow. The meal itself was served in courses: soup, fish, meat, game, puddings, and finally dessert. Between courses, conversation turned to politics, travel, or the latest events in London society. Servants moved quietly around the room, refilling glasses and replacing plates. After dinner, the guests returned to the drawing room. The evening might end with music. A piano played softly, or someone singing, or with games such as charades. For those inclined, the smoking room offered cigars and brandy, the air thick with fragrant smoke. When the guests retired, their rooms were lit by oil lamps or candles, the bed turned down, the fire burning low. Outside, the countryside lay in deep quiet, broken only by the faint hoot of an owl or the sound of wind in the trees. The weekend would end on Monday morning, with carriages or motor cars taking the guests back to the railway station. For them, it was a brief interlude of comfort and sociability, a world away from the crowded, smoky streets where so many Victorians lived their entire lives. The day begins before sunrise, even in the long days of summer. In the dim light, you stir from your bed, perhaps little more than a low wooden frame covered with woolen blankets and animal skins. The air in the longhouse is cool, carrying the faint tang of smoke from the central hearth, which has burned low overnight. Around you, the space is shared with your family, perhaps several generations under one roof, and sometimes a few of the smaller livestock during the coldest months. Privacy is rare. The low murmur of voices, the shifting of blankets, and the occasional bleat from a goat or sheep are familiar parts of waking life. Stepping outside, the morning air greets you with a chill, even in midsummer. The scent of damp earth rises from the ground, mixed with the salty breath of the sea. If your farm lies near the coast, in the distance, gulls call, their cries carried on a breeze that stirs the tall grass. Your tasks vary with the season. In spring and summer, there is planting to be done. Barley, rye, and oats sown carefully, with the hope that the weather will be kind. There are fences to repair, tools to mend, and fishing lines to check. Fishing is not merely an occasional chore, it is a constant necessity. Nets must be dried and repaired, boats caulked to keep out the water, and the day's catch salted or smoked before it can spoil. Livestock require constant attention. Sheep and goats provide wool and milk, but they must be herded to pasture and guarded from predators. Cattle are valuable for both milk and labor, pulling plows in the fields. Chickens provide eggs, though they must be penned or they will scatter. Preserving food for winter is a summer-long project. Fish are salted and stored in barrels. Meat is smoked over low fires or dried in the wind. Dairy is transformed into cheese and butter that can keep for months. Grain is ground into flour and stored in dry bins. Every preserved item is a small safeguard against the lean months ahead. The weather is rarely gentle. Rain can sweep in from the sea without warning, soaking you to the bone before you can reach shelter. In winter, snow piles high against the longhouse walls, and the cold seeps through even the thickest woolens. Inside, the hearth smokes heavily, and the air grows thick with it, stinging the eyes and lungs. Yet it is the only source of heat, and without it, survival is impossible. In such a life, there is little rest. The work is repetitive but essential, dictated by the turning of the seasons. And while there is camaraderie, neighbors helping with harvest, shared meals during the brief festivals, there is also the constant awareness that a single failed crop, a disease among livestock, or a harsh winter can bring hardship that will take years to recover from. Still, there is a rhythm to it all. The same paths worn in the grass between house and field, the same tools passed from parent to child, the same tasks repeated day after day, year after year. It is not the life of sagas and voyages, but it is the life that sustained the world from which those stories came. And as you settle back into the longhouse at night, the wind rattling the shutters, you feel the weight of another day's work behind you, and the knowledge that tomorrow it will begin again. Leif Erikson's story begins in Iceland, around the year 970, in a household already shaped by the sea and by exile. His father, Eric the Red, had left Norway under a sentence of outlawry, and later fled Iceland for similar reasons, sailing west to settle in the land he would name Greenland. It was in this unsettled, windswept environment that Leif grew up, a world where the horizon was both a limit and an invitation. Imagine the young Leif, standing on the edge of a rocky shore, the sea rolling out before him in shades of steel grey, the wind snapping at his cloak. Ships were a constant presence, the long narrow hulls pulled up on beaches, their carved prows rising like the heads of sea creatures. The smell of tar from caulking, mingled with salt air, would have been part of daily life. As a young man, Leif travelled to Norway. There, he entered the service of King Olaf Tryggvason, a ruler with a strong interest in spreading Christianity throughout the Norse world. Leif was baptized and, according to the sagas, tasked with bringing the new faith back to Greenland. But his most famous journey was not toward home, nor toward familiar lands, but farther still, toward a place beyond the maps of his time. The story of that voyage comes to us through sagas written down centuries later, blending fact and memory with the embellishments of storytelling. According to these accounts, Leif sailed west from Greenland, guided by rumors of a rich and fertile land, spotted by another sailor, Bjarni, who had been blown off course. For days, the sea stretched around them, the horizon a slow, unchanging arc. The wind would shift unpredictably, and the crew's muscles ached from the rhythm of rowing when the air stilled. Nights brought the creak of wood, the slap of water against the hull, and the muted conversations of men staring into the darkness, keeping watch for reefs or sudden storms. The first land they reached was a rocky, barren shore, perhaps what we know today as Baffin Island. Here, the air was sharp and cold, the ground hard beneath a thin covering of moss and stone. They did not stay. Sailing south, they came to a wooded coast, which they called Markland, the forest land. The smell of pine and spruce drifted over the water as they approached, and the sight of tall trees must have promised resources valuable to those who came from treeless Greenland. But again, they moved on. Finally, they reached a place unlike the others, with milder weather, wild grapes, and grassy meadows. The sagas call it Vinland. Whether it was Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, or somewhere farther south, we cannot say with certainty, but in the telling, it is a place of abundance, salmon thick in the rivers, forests for building, and pastures for grazing animals. Leif and his men built houses there, wintering in this new land. Imagine the quiet of a settlement so far from any other, the crackle of fires at night, the smell of smoked fish hanging in storehouses, and the soft hum of the wind in unfamiliar trees. It was a place full of promise, but also of uncertainty, distant from any support should misfortune strike. In spring, they returned to Greenland, their ship heavy with timber, and perhaps other goods from Vinland. Leif's voyage became the first recorded European landing in North America, though in his own lifetime it may not have seemed the monumental event it appears to us now. It was another journey in a world where travel was a necessity, where seas were both road and barrier, and where the unknown could be as dangerous as it was tempting. In later years, Leif is remembered in the sagas as Leif the Lucky, not for any single victory, but for surviving where others had perished, for returning where others had vanished into the sea. His journey to Vinland did not spark a permanent settlement, but it carved his name into the long memory of Norse exploration. As the stories spread, they became part of a tradition in which the line between history and legend blurred, as it so often does. The creak of oars, the hiss of the wind, the sight of a new coastline after days at sea, all these are echoes from a time when the world seemed far larger, and each voyage was a step into mystery. When the sagas spoke of Vinland, they described it as a place worth remembering, fertile, mild, and rich in resources. Yet after Leif Erikson's voyage and a few others, the trail seems to fade. The settlements mentioned in these old stories disappear from the historical record. What became of them remains one of the quiet mysteries of Viking history. For centuries, scholars debated whether Vinland had ever truly existed. The sagas were written down long after the voyages, shaped by generations of retelling. Some believed they were entirely myth, allegories wrapped in seafaring detail. Others argued they contained kernels of truth, waiting to be uncovered. The first tangible clue came in the 1960s, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, at a place called Lonso Meadows. Archaeologists Helge and Anstein Ingstad uncovered the remains of turf-walled buildings. These were not the homes of indigenous peoples who had long lived in the region, but structures built in the Norse style, the same type found in Iceland and Greenland. The site revealed the outline of halls, smaller huts, and workshops. The wood and turf had long since softened into the ground, leaving gentle mounds, but the artifacts told their own quiet story. Iron nails, a spindle whirl for spinning yarn, a bronze pin used to fasten cloaks, even the waste left behind, slag from ironworking, spoke of a community that had come prepared to repair ships and tools. The location made sense for a first landing. It was a sheltered place, close to fishing waters, with easy access to timber. Yet the settlement at Lonso Meadows was small, perhaps a base camp rather than a permanent colony, and after a brief time, it seems to have been abandoned. Why? The sagas hint at tensions. They describe encounters with the Skrillinger, the Norse term for the indigenous peoples they met. These meetings may have begun with trade, but turned to conflict. There is no way to confirm the details, but it is easy to imagine the risks of staying too long in a land where one was unwelcome, especially with no reinforcements nearby. Other theories focus on logistics. The distance from Greenland was vast, the voyages dangerous, and the needs of home pressing. Each ship that set sail had to weigh the benefit of timber and fish against the risk of storms, shipwrecks, or ice blocking the return passage. Beyond Lonso Meadows, there are tantalizing traces. pieces of Norse-style yarn found in the Canadian Arctic, wooden artifacts that may have been traded over great distances, stories in indigenous oral traditions that could reference these fleeting encounters, but no other confirmed Viking site in North America has been found. Archaeologists still search. Some follow the hints in the sagas, mapping descriptions of sailing days and coastal features onto modern charts. Others use technology, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, to look for the faint marks of turf walls beneath fields and forests. And there is always the possibility that the best evidence lies not in the soil, but in the quiet exchange of goods and ideas. Iron nails, wooden carvings, bits of woven cloth, passed from hand to hand across cultures until their origin was forgotten. What is clear is that the Viking presence in North America was brief. It left little behind but questions, a single confirmed site, and the enduring sense of a story that ends just beyond the edge of certainty. As with so many archaeological mysteries, we are left with fragments, a bead, a nail, the curve of an ancient wall. They do not shout their answers. They simply rest in the earth, silent, waiting for the moment someone uncovers them again. Imagine the long hole in the heart of a chieftain's settlement. It is not a small place. Its timber walls rise high, and the roof beams arched like the ribs of an upturned ship. In the darkness of a winter night, its glow is visible from far across the snow-dusted fields, a warm beacon for those approaching. Inside, the air is thick with the mingled scents of smoke, roasted meat, and the earthy temps of woolen cloaks drying by the fire. The central hearth runs the length of the hall, its flames fed by split logs. Smoke curls upward, slipping through a vent in the roof, but not before it has drifted through the air and softened the outlines of people's faces. Benches line the walls, covered in furs for comfort. The chieftain's high seat stands at one end, elevated slightly, with carved posts on either side. To be seated close to the chieftain is a sign of honor. To be placed farther down the benches is a quiet signal of one's lesser standing. The feast begins long before the eating. Guests arrive bearing gifts, perhaps a finely made belt, a carved drinking horn, or a length of woven cloth. These are not merely tokens of friendship. They are part of the unspoken economy of loyalty. The chieftain, in turn, will bestow gifts later, perhaps a silver arm ring, a fine blade, or a promise of land. When the food is brought in, it comes on great wooden platters: roasted lamb, fish caught from icy waters, bread made from barley, and bowls of stewed root vegetables. Some dishes are simple, others spiced with imported flavorings, brought by traders who have sailed far south. At the head table, the choicest cuts are served first. Drinking is a central part of the gathering. Horns and cups are filled with mead, honey wine, or ale. The serving is deliberate, following a rhythm. The horn might pass from the chieftain to his most trusted ally, then to others in turn, each person making a brief toast before drinking. Between courses, there is entertainment, skalds reciting poetry of past battles, sagas of gods and heroes, or songs that remember voyages across distant seas. The verses are long, with a steady, chanting pace, as much for the memory as for the enjoyment. In the flicker of the firelight, the words seem to fold into the moment, blurring the line between the past and the present. Such feasts are more than celebrations. They are political theater. To be seen in the chieftain's hall is to affirm one's place in the web of alliances. Decisions might be whispered at the edges of the gathering, agreements over land, plans for raids, or settlements of disputes. Every guest is both participant and observer in this unspoken negotiation of power. As the night deepens, the tone changes. The toasts grow slower, the fire burns lower, and conversation shifts to more personal matters. Someone might speak of a good harvest, another of a son's first voyage. The chieftain listens, offering quiet nods, storing these small pieces of news as carefully as any merchant would store coin. By the time the last horn is drained, the snow outside is deep and silent. The guests leave in small groups, cloaks pulled tight, their footprints marking the way back through the darkness. Inside the hall, the fire smolders, its embers a dull red glow, holding the last warmth of the night. In the stillness that follows, the feast is over, but its purpose lingers. Bonds have been strengthened, hierarchies affirmed, and the chieftain's place at the center of it all remains unshaken. Imagine opening your eyes to a pale, thin light, barely breaking through a sky the color of ash. The air is sharp and dry, and you can see your breath before you. Around you, other men are stirring in the cramped shelter. Not quite a room, not quite a tent, but something improvised from whatever could be found. Rough planks, woven mats, scraps of cloth. The cold is constant. Even as you sleep, it presses into you, and waking only makes it sharper. There is no warm meal waiting. The food you have is hard, dry, perhaps a handful of millet or coarse bread from the day before. The work ahead will be long, but the fuel for it is meager. Men chew slowly, conserving each bite. Some drink water chilled too near freezing. Others wait, knowing they will carry thirst with them to the work site. You step outside. The wind is immediate, catching the edges of your clothing and driving grains of frozen earth against your skin. The land here is not gentle. Steep hills rise to the north, rolling toward jagged peaks, while the ground underfoot shifts between loose soil and patches of stubborn rock. Somewhere ahead, the outline of the wall in progress clings to the ridgeline, not the continuous stone ribbon that later centuries would produce, but a rough, uneven barrier, interrupted by scaffolding and piles of materials. Tools are gathered, wooden wheelbarrows with crude iron fittings, baskets woven for carrying earth, spades with worn handles, and hammers that bear the marks of long use. The sound begins early, the first clatter of stone on stone, the muted thud of tamped earth. It is a rhythm that will continue for hours without pause, broken only when the overseer's voice cuts through the air, sharp and commanding. The winters here are punishing. The wind does not simply blow, it moves through the gaps in clothing, around the seams of boots, until it feels as though it comes from within you. Hands stiffen, breath stings the throat, and yet the work goes on. Earth is dug from trenches, hoisted up in baskets, poured into wooden frames to be tamped down layer by layer. Stones are hauled from quarries, moved along human chains where each man takes the weight for a few steps before passing it to the next. There is danger in every part of the day. A misstep on loose soil can send a man sliding down a slope. An overloaded basket can break a back or twist an ankle. And in the coldest months, frostbite can take a man out of the workforce just as surely as any injury. The overseers carry tall staffs, their eyes scanning the workers for any sign of idleness. The pace is not allowed to slacken. If a man falls behind, others must carry the load, and resentment grows quietly in the lines of their faces. Even midday brings little relief. The sun, when it appears, offers light but no real warmth. The meal is simple. More millet, perhaps a thin soup if supplies are generous. Men squat or sit on whatever is near, eating in silence. Laughter is rare here, though sometimes an old story will be told, half for distraction, half for the memory of better times. When work resumes, it continues until the sky darkens again. By evening, the wall has grown, but only by a small measure. A layer of tamped earth here, a new stretch of stone laid there. Progress is slow, and each day feels much like the one before. In the night, the cold deepens. The wind presses against the shelters, rattling anything loose. You try to sleep, knowing that tomorrow will be the same. Harsh wind, heavy loads, and the endless horizon of work ahead. And yet, this wall, though still incomplete, stretches far enough that you cannot see its end. It is more than a barrier. It is a statement, one that demands the effort of countless hands, in every season, for years without pause. And tomorrow, you will rise again to add your part to it. Long before the wall became a landmark recognized around the world, it was the vision of a man who saw himself as the unifier of all under heaven. His name, in the end, would not be remembered as his given one, but as a title. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Imagine a young boy, born in the year 259 BCE, in a time when China was not yet one country, but a collection of rival states. Each state was guarded, mistrustful, and determined to expand its borders. The boy's early life was shaped by palace intrigue, shifting alliances, and the constant hum of political tension. He was heir to the throne of Qin, a Western state known for its discipline and its military strength. When he ascended to power as a teenager, his position was far from secure. Advisors, generals, and rival states all had their own designs, but the young king proved both determined and calculating. Over the years, he would employ a combination of military campaigns, strategic marriages, and careful diplomacy to weaken his enemies. One by one, the rival states fell to Qin forces, until, in 221 BCE, the dream of unification became reality. It was then that he took the name Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of Qin. It was not merely a royal title. It was a declaration that a new political order had begun. China, for the first time, was ruled as a single empire. The emperor moved quickly to bind this vast land together. He standardized currency so that a coin minted in the far south would be worth the same as one from the north. He introduced a unified system of weights and measures, ensuring that merchants could trade without disputes over inconsistent standards. Even the written script was standardized, so that officials and scholars from different regions could communicate in the same form. But perhaps the most ambitious and most demanding of his projects was the expansion and connection of existing defensive walls into what would become the early form of the Great Wall. It was not the stone-clad structure you might picture today, but an immense series of earthen ramparts, trenches, and watchtowers, stretching across difficult and often hostile terrain. For the emperor, the wall was more than a physical barrier. It was a symbol of unity, strength, and control. It kept out nomadic raiders from the north, but it also marked the edge of imperial authority, a visible line across the land. To build it, he called upon soldiers, peasants, and prisoners alike, sending them far from home to work in exhausting, dangerous conditions. Many would never return. Qin Shi Huang was a man who sought to control not only the present, but the future. He commissioned vast road networks, so his armies and messengers could move swiftly. He built grand palaces and administrative centers to house his government, and he began construction of the enormous tomb that would become one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries in history. But with power came fear. The emperor became deeply concerned with threats to his life, not only from assassins, but from the natural limits of mortality. He sent expeditions in search of mythical islands, said to hold the secret to immortality. He consumed elixirs prepared by court alchemists, believing they might prolong his life, though these often contained mercury and other harmful substances. By the time of his death in 210 BCE, Qin Shi Huang had transformed China in ways that would echo for millennia. He had brought together lands that had warred for centuries, set in motion projects that reshaped the landscape, and left behind monuments of ambition on an imperial scale. Yet his legacy was not simple. The Qin dynasty, for all its achievements, lasted only 15 years. The labor demands, heavy taxes, and strict laws imposed under his rule bred resentment, and after his passing, rebellions swept across the empire. Still, the foundations he laid in governance, infrastructure, and the very idea of a unified China endured long after the dynasty itself was gone. In the quiet of the evening, you might imagine him standing on a high platform, looking out toward the northern hills, where the line of the wall fades into the distance. For all his efforts to command time, his own would run out. But the wall, in one form or another, would remain. Beneath a low, grassy mound in Shanxi province lies one of the most enigmatic burial sites in the world. From the outside, it does not seem imposing. A tree-covered rise that could easily be mistaken for a natural hill. But this is no ordinary earthwork. It is the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, a resting place designed on a scale to match his vision of rule over all under heaven. The story of its discovery is a relatively recent one. In 1974, farmers digging a well near the village of Lintong struck something unexpected: fragments of life-sized clay figures, their faces, hands, and armor still showing remarkable detail after more than 2,000 years underground. Archaeologists soon realized that this was not a handful of statues, but part of an entire army. The famous terracotta warriors, imagine stepping into the excavation pits. Rows upon rows of clay soldiers stand in formation, each one unique, with carefully molded facial features, hairstyles, and armor suited to their rank. Some grip long-lost wooden spears or swords, now decayed, but their posture still suggests readiness for battle. The horses, too, are sculpted with attentive precision, harnesses captured in clay, ears forward as though awaiting a signal to move. These warriors were not meant to fight a real war. They were placed here to guard the emperor in the afterlife, a reflection of his belief that his authority would continue beyond death, and that he would need protection and order in the world to come. The army's arrangement mirrors real military formations, with infantry, archers, chariots, and cavalry carefully positioned as they might have been on an actual battlefield. But the warriors are only part of the mausoleum complex. Historical records, particularly from the historian Sima Qian, speak of a vast underground palace beneath the mound, complete with miniature rivers flowing with mercury to represent the great waterways of China. There are said to be replicas of mountains, ceilings inlaid with precious stones to mimic the stars, and treasures beyond counting. To this day, the main burial chamber of Qin Shi Huang remains unopened. The reasons are both practical and ethical. On a practical level, the technology to safely excavate such a fragile and complex site is still evolving. Even exposure to air could cause pigments, structures, and artifacts to deteriorate rapidly. On an ethical level, there is an understanding among many archaeologists that disturbing the tomb too soon could result in irreversible loss, and perhaps that such a resting place should not be entered lightly. The mention of mercury is more than legend. Soil tests around the mound have revealed unusually high concentrations of the element, supporting ancient descriptions of its use in the tomb. In the emperor's time, mercury was associated with both longevity and danger, a paradox that mirrors the emperor's own quest for immortality, which may have hastened his death. Walking among the pits of the terracotta army today, you notice that only a fraction of the warriors have been fully excavated. Many remain buried, preserved in darkness. The work is slow, deliberate, and conducted with a constant awareness that once something is uncovered, the clock starts ticking on its preservation. The mystery of what lies within the central mound has fueled endless speculation. Is there truly a map of the empire rendered in gold and silver? Are the emperor's personal artifacts, perhaps even records of his reign, still sealed within? Or has time already claimed much of what was once placed there? For now, the mound remains closed, a silent guardian over its own secrets. It is, in its way, like the Great Wall itself, a monument to human ambition, endurance, and the belief that some legacies can stand against the erosion of time. And perhaps, as the evening deepens and shadows lengthen across the excavation site, you can picture the figures underground, holding their posts in perfect stillness, waiting in a silence that has lasted more than 2 millennia. The Forbidden City in Beijing is vast and enclosed, a self-contained world of walls, gates, and courtyards. Within its red lacquered halls and golden roofs, daily life for an imperial courtier was a balance of ceremony, politics, and quiet waiting. Waiting for the right moment to be seen, to speak, to act. Imagine walking through the Meridian Gate just after dawn. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of sandalwood from the incense burned inside halls. The flagstones underfoot are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Somewhere beyond the next set of gates, the emperor is beginning his day. But to reach him, layers of protocol must be observed. A courtier's morning began early, often before the first light had brushed the palace roofs. Attendants would bring robes appropriate to the day's duties, perhaps formal attire for an audience, with intricate embroidery denoting rank and service. Every stitch had meaning, from the pattern of waves at the hem to the depiction of birds or dragons on the chest. Even the hat, stiffened and adorned with beads or insignia, was part of the silent language of hierarchy. Once dressed, a courtier would join others in the great outer courtyards. Here, officials of varying ranks assembled in precise order, standing according to seniority and responsibility. The ritual was less about conversation than about presence. The emperor needed to see loyalty arranged before him, a living symbol of the empire's structure. In the audience hall, the air was hushed except for the measured tread of guards and the rustle of robes. When the emperor entered, all eyes lowered. No one spoke without permission. A courtier might present a memorial, a written request, report, or piece of advice, and then retreat without knowing whether it would be accepted, rejected, or ignored. After formal duties, the rest of the day might be a mixture of work and waiting. There were discussions in side chambers, careful exchanges of news and favors, and the constant reading of political undercurrents. To survive in the court was to know when to act and when to remain still, when to speak and when to let silence serve as your ally. Meals were another ritual. In the Forbidden City, dining was rarely just about food. If invited to share a meal in a secondary hall, a courtier might be served delicacies from the imperial kitchens, steamed buns filled with sweet lotus paste, soups scented with ginger, or dishes of fish dressed in light sauces. Each course arrived in porcelain or lacquerware, and even the sequence of dishes was governed by tradition. Not all of a courtier's time was spent in formal spaces. Gardens within the palace offered quiet walks among rockeries, pavilions, and old cypress trees. Here, conversations could take a more personal tone, but always within the bounds of caution. In the Forbidden City, even the most casual words could be overheard and carried to unintended ears. As evening came, the palace took on a different stillness. Drums sounded the watch, and lamps lit the corridors with a warm glow. A courtier might retire to his assigned quarters, simple in furnishing compared to the grand halls, but still part of the imperial world. The night air carried the faint clang of distant gates being locked, sealing the palace until morning. In many ways, the life of a courtier was not about grand gestures, but about precision and patience, the ability to endure the slow rhythm of court life, to navigate its rituals, and to remain in favor while others rose and fell. Like the Great Wall itself, it required persistence, quiet watchfulness, and the acceptance that much of the work was invisible, known only to those who walked those corridors. The life of a medieval monk began in darkness. Long before sunrise, a bell would ring in the still air. Its sound was neither hurried nor loud, but it carried through the cold stone corridors, summoning the brothers from their narrow beds. The dormitory was unheated, the air in winter sharp enough to make each breath visible. Wool blankets and rough linen sheets provided some comfort, but the cold seeped in regardless. There was no time for lingering. Each man rose, dressed in his habit, a long wool tunic with a hood, and made his way to the church for the first prayers of the day, the office of matins. This could take place as early as 2 or 3 in the morning. The church itself was lit only by candles, the flickering light casting long shadows across carved wooden stalls. The voices of the monks rose together, chanting psalms in Latin. The pace was deliberate, unchanging, like the slow breathing of the monastery itself. After matins came lauds, the morning praise, as the first hint of grey entered the sky. The monastery's day was divided into these hours of prayer, each with its own purpose and tone. Between them, there was work, physical, necessary, and often tiring. In some monasteries, monks worked in the fields, tending crops of barley, oats, or vegetables. They might herd sheep, milk cows, or care for the orchard. In others, especially in larger communities, there were designated brothers for copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, a task requiring patience, steady hands, and sharp eyes. Even indoors, work was no easier. The scriptorium could be as cold as the dormitory in winter, and as stifling as a kitchen in summer. Food was simple and regulated. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided many monasteries, discouraged excess. Meals were often vegetarian, based on bread, pottage, and occasionally fish. Meat was generally avoided, except perhaps in the infirmary. On fasting days, and there were many, portions were smaller, and certain foods were absent altogether. Watered ale or weak wine was the usual drink, and conversation during meals was replaced by readings from religious texts. Eating was not a social event, but another form of devotion. Silence was one of the most striking aspects of monastic life. It was not total. Monks spoke when necessary for work or instruction, but there were long stretches when words were set aside. This cultivated reflection, but it could also create a sense of isolation even among many people. A nod, a gesture, or a shared glance became the primary language between prayers. Manual labor, strict schedules, cold winters, and limited food were the daily realities. But these hardships were not accidents. They were seen as tools for spiritual growth. The body was disciplined so that the soul could be freed from distraction. Still, for the men living this life, each day was a test of endurance, as much as a path to holiness. When the final prayers ended at night, Compline spoken softly under dim candlelight, the day's rhythm came full circle. The dormitory awaited, cold as before, and in only a few hours, the bell would ring again. In the quiet of a medieval library, surrounded by shelves of parchment manuscripts, you might imagine a monk's life to be entirely one of obedience and submission. But sometimes, within those cloistered walls, ideas formed that reached far beyond the monastery, ideas that would challenge the highest authority in Christendom. William of Ockham was one such monk. Born around the year 1287 in the small English village of Ockham, he entered the Franciscan order while still young. The Franciscans were known for their strict commitment to poverty, following the example of Saint Francis of Assisi. This vow of poverty was not symbolic. It was a central pillar of their way of life, a deliberate rejection of wealth and ownership. William proved to be an exceptional student. His sharp mind drew him into the study of philosophy and theology, and eventually to Oxford, where he studied and taught. But unlike some scholars of his time, William was not content to simply repeat accepted ideas. He examined them carefully, tested them, and was willing to disagree when he felt the reasoning was flawed. His habit of stripping away unnecessary complexity in argument would later be remembered as Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is often the best. In the early 14th century, the Church was not only a spiritual authority, but also a vast political power. The Pope claimed a supremacy that extended over kings and emperors, influencing laws, disputes, and the governance of nations. Many accepted this as the natural order. William did not. His conflict with the papacy began with a dispute over the Franciscan vow of poverty. The Pope at the time, John the 22nd, argued that the Church had the right to hold property, even if individual monks did not. William and others believed this contradicted the very foundation of their order, that Christ and his apostles had owned nothing at all. Summoned to Avignon, where the papal court was then based, William faced charges of heresy. The city, though beautiful, must have felt stifling. The Pope's palace loomed large, both physically and in authority. Here, under the watch of powerful men, William could not speak freely without risk, and so, in 1328, he fled. Under cover of night, William escaped Avignon with a small group of fellow Franciscans. They sought protection from a most unlikely source, the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV of Bavaria, who was himself in conflict with the Pope. In the emperor's court, William found a place to write and to argue against papal overreach. His writings were bold but measured, laying out the limits of papal authority and the rights of secular rulers. In doing so, he became not just a philosopher, but a political thinker whose ideas would echo for centuries. William's later years were spent in exile, moving between cities, always under the emperor's protection. He never returned to England, and he never reconciled with the papacy. When he died, around 1347, he left behind not only his philosophical works, but also the example of a monk who had dared to place reason and conscience above obedience to the most powerful man in the medieval world. His story reminds us that even within the most ordered and disciplined communities, there were those who thought independently, and sometimes those thoughts were too large to be contained by the monastery walls. In many medieval monasteries, the buildings we see today are only the surface of what once existed. Behind thick stone walls, down narrow staircases, and through doors disguised as wooden panels, there were spaces known to only a few. Some were practical, others mysterious, and over centuries, many were forgotten entirely. Imagine walking through a quiet cloister on a late afternoon. The stone underfoot has been worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet. Arched windows let in a pale, steady light, casting long shadows on the walls. At first glance, the layout seemed simple. A chapel, a refectory for meals, a dormitory for sleep. But monastic life was far more layered than what was visible to visitors, or even to some of the brothers themselves. One of the most important hidden spaces was the scriptorium. This was not always marked by a grand doorway. In smaller monasteries, it might be tucked away in a chamber warmed by a single hearth, where scribes bent over desks copying texts by hand. The air here would have been thick with the faint scent of parchment and ink, a mix of soot from the lamps and the iron-rich tang of gall ink. The work required silence, and often the room was arranged so that each monk worked in his own small cubicle, the walls blocking out even the movement of others. Some monasteries also contained concealed libraries. Books were precious, sometimes worth more than an entire farm, and certain volumes were considered too valuable or too dangerous to be left in the open. A locked cabinet might be built into the wall, or a chamber reached only through a winding stair from the abbot's private rooms. In troubled times, such spaces could protect manuscripts from theft, fire, or confiscation. Centuries later, when renovations or archaeological work uncovered them, these hidden rooms sometimes still held forgotten texts, their pages darkened with age but their words preserved. There were also more practical secret spaces. Some monastic orders kept storerooms hidden away for preserving surplus food, wine, or medicinal herbs. These were often accessible only to the cellarer, the monk responsible for supplies. In times of scarcity, when outside pressures threatened the community, these stores could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. A few of the most intriguing hidden chambers were built for safety. In certain border regions, monasteries faced threats from raiders or hostile armies. Passageways were designed to be narrow and easily defended, or to lead out into surrounding forests or fields. These were not common. Most monasteries relied on their walls and the sanctity of the church for protection, but where they existed, they speak of a quiet awareness that peace was never guaranteed. Even in peaceful regions, secrecy had its uses. Some rooms were reserved for private meetings between abbots and visiting nobles or bishops, away from the ears of the broader community. Here, matters of land, tithes, and political alliances were discussed under the cover of heavy doors and thick stone. In recent decades, archaeology has revealed just how much can still be hidden within these ancient structures. Ground-penetrating radar has shown outlines of chambers beneath cloisters that were long thought to be solid foundations. When opened, they sometimes reveal shelves carved directly into the stone, or carved niches where candles once burned. Even without knowing exactly what was stored there, the design itself suggests careful planning and secrecy. There is something almost timeless about these discoveries, the sense that medieval monks, while devoted to prayer and simplicity, also lived in a world where privacy, preservation, and even security required physical architecture. And as we walk through their halls today, it's worth remembering that what we see is only a fraction of what once existed. Most people think of monasteries as places of strict silence, fasting, and austere meals, and for the majority of monks, this was true. But there were occasions, often tied to feast days or visits from important guests, when the atmosphere shifted entirely. On those days, the abbot's hall became the center of a very different kind of monastic life. Picture a long, timbered room warmed by a great hearth at one end. The air carries the rich scent of roasted meat, spiced wine, and freshly baked bread. Candles line the tables, their soft light catching on polished wooden platters and goblets of pewter. The abbot's table sits slightly apart, not raised high like a king's dais, but clearly marked as the seat of honor. Around it, fellow abbots, visiting bishops, noble patrons, and trusted guests take their places, while the hum of conversation fills the space. For these occasions, the menu might be far more elaborate than the daily fare of bread, pottage, and watered ale. You might find salmon baked in pastry, capons dressed with herbs, or trenchers piled with cheese and fruit brought in from nearby estates. In wealthier monasteries, imported spices like cinnamon or cloves might perfume certain dishes, not for extravagance alone, but to demonstrate the monastery's connections to trade networks that reached far beyond the local countryside. These feasts were not merely about food. They were opportunities for diplomacy. A noble might be persuaded to grant land in exchange for prayers for his family's souls. A bishop might be quietly reminded of the monastery's loyalty or its need for certain privileges. In this way, the abbot's hall became a place where both spiritual and earthly concerns were served side by side. Music sometimes accompanied the meal. A small group of musicians, perhaps lay brothers skilled with the harp or flute, might play in the background. The melodies were gentle, steady, never raucous, and often drawn from religious themes, ensuring that the gathering retained a sense of dignity. The monks serving the tables would move quietly, ensuring that trenchers were kept full and cups were refilled. Even in this more relaxed setting, there was a rhythm and order to the proceedings. A prayer might open the feast, and another close it, drawing a clear line between celebration and indulgence. As the evening wore on, the fire would burn low, the music would soften, and conversations would turn to quieter matters. A recent harvest, a pilgrimage undertaken, news from the wider church. When the guests departed, the hall would slowly return to its ordinary state, the long tables wiped clean, the benches pushed back, the smell of wood smoke lingering in the rafters. To a monk, these occasions were rare. Days like this stood out against the backdrop of fasting and routine, but they were also reminders of the monastery's place in the web of medieval society, not isolated from the world, but quietly connected to its currents of power, wealth, and obligation. Imagine waking not to birdsong or the warmth of the sun, but to the damp chill of a cramped wooden berth. Above you, the low planks drip with condensation. Around you, the air is thick, not with fresh salt breeze, but with the mingled scents of tar, sweat, damp rope, and food stores slowly spoiling. The ship is alive beneath you. Every wave makes the timbers groan, the ropes creak, the barrels roll slightly in their lashings. From somewhere forward, you hear the steady slap of water against the hull, and above, the muffled shouts of the watch changing shift. Space is scarce. Most sailors and passengers sleep in narrow bunks, stacked like shelves, or even on the bare deck in foul weather. There is little privacy. You might share your sleeping space with the constant movement of rats, creatures that thrive on spilled grain and the crumbs from the ship's hard biscuits. Those biscuits, the mainstay of your diet, are hard enough to break teeth, and often crawling with weevils. The trick, they say, is to eat them in the dark, so you will not see the small black shapes moving against the pale bread. Salted meat, long since stripped of freshness, adds variety only in name. Fresh food, if there was any at all, is gone within weeks of departure. The water, stored in great wooden casks, turns stale quickly, and after a month, carries the sour tang of rot. The days are filled with unchanging labor. If you are crew, you haul ropes, scrub decks, patch sails. If you are a passenger, there is little to do but endure the passage of time. The horizon remains stubbornly the same, a thin line where water meets sky. Weather can turn in moments. A calm morning may become an afternoon of rising wind, the ship leaning under the weight of its own sails, water hissing along the gunwales. During storms, the world becomes a deafening rush of wind and crashing seas, and below deck, you cling to your berth as barrels and crates shift violently in the dark. And then there is sickness. Scurvy, the slow, painful depletion of the body's strength, creeps through the crew after weeks without fresh fruit or vegetables. Other illnesses, too, pass quickly in such close quarters, where one man's cough becomes the cough of half the ship by week's end. Nights are long, filled with the groan of the ship's frame and the distant, endless rhythm of the ocean. Some sleep fitfully. Others stare into the dark, waiting for dawn, knowing that the next day will be much like the last. The sea is vast, and until land appears on the horizon, you are at the mercy of its moods, patient, enduring, caught between where you left and where you hope to arrive. Imagine, if you will, the same rolling grey horizon, but now, at its center, stands a figure whose name would be woven into the maps of the New World. Henry Hudson, an English navigator, emerges in the historical record in the first decade of the 1600s, a time when much of the globe was still unknown to European eyes, and the promise of new trade routes drove men into dangerous waters. Hudson's story is not one of a single journey, but of repeated attempts to find what was thought to be possible: a northern passage, a route over the top of the world, or through the icy waters of North America, that would connect Europe to the riches of Asia. In 1607, we find him at the helm of the Hopewell, sailing north along the icy coast of Greenland. Through waters choked with drifting floes, the crew's breath freezes in the air. They push farther north than most would dare, but the ice is impenetrable, a glittering wall stretching from horizon to horizon. The following year, Hudson tries again, but the cold is relentless. This time, instead of finding the gateway to Asia, he returns with detailed observations of the Arctic seas, valuable to cartographers perhaps, but not the golden route his sponsors desired. By 1609, his reputation as a skilled navigator earns him a new commission, this time from the Dutch East India Company. The ship is the Half Moon, the Half Moon, and the original plan is to head once more into the north. But ice and hostile conditions push him westward, and soon he finds himself tracing the coast of North America. Sailing into what we now call New York Harbor, Hudson steers his vessel up a broad, tidal river. The river would later bear his name, the Hudson River. But for Hudson himself, it was another question mark. Could this be a route to the Pacific? The answer, as he discovered after days of sailing inland, was no. Still, the voyage gave the Dutch a claim to the region, and planted the seeds of what would become New Amsterdam, later New York. His final voyage, in 1610, is both his most ambitious and his most tragic. This time, sailing for England, Hudson takes the Discovery into the vast inland sea we now know as Hudson Bay. For months, the crew charts its frigid coasts, but winter closes in early. Ice locks the ship fast, and the men are forced to overwinter on shore in makeshift shelters. Food runs low. The bitter cold seeps into their bones. When spring finally comes, the ice breaks, but so does the trust between Hudson and his men. In June 1611, the crew mutinies. Hudson, his teenage son, and several loyal crewmen are set adrift in a small open boat. They are never seen again. Today, Henry Hudson is remembered both for his discoveries and for the mystery of his end. His name is fixed to rivers, bays, and straits. but his final resting place is somewhere beneath the cold, grey waters he sought to master. Picture, if you will, a calm morning in December of 1872. The Atlantic is quiet, the surface ruffled only by a gentle swell. A small brigantine, the Dei Gratia, sails steadily along her course between Portugal and the Azores. On the horizon, another ship appears, moving erratically, sails partially set, as if no steady hand holds the helm. When the Dei Gratia draws closer, the name becomes visible on the stern: Mary Celeste. She had left New York only a month earlier, bound for Genoa with a cargo of industrial alcohol. The ship is sound, her sails still in decent order, but there is something deeply wrong. No one is on deck. No voice answers the hails. A boarding party climbs over the rail. They find the ship eerily empty. The lifeboat is missing, and below deck the cabins are damp and disordered, as though left in haste. Half-eaten meals sit in the galley. The cargo is intact. The ship's log ends abruptly, its last entry giving no hint of trouble. And so begins one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. Theories have multiplied over the decades. Some suggest sudden storms or a rare column of spray and wind may have startled the crew into abandoning ship. Others speak of fumes from the alcohol barrels, perhaps leaking and igniting panic of an imminent explosion. Yet when the barrels were examined, they were largely intact, and the ship itself showed no signs of fire. There are darker speculations. Pirates, though rare in that part of the Atlantic, were not unknown, but nothing was stolen. Mutiny has been proposed, yet the Mary Celeste's captain, Benjamin Briggs, was by all accounts respected and steady-handed. He had sailed with his wife and young daughter on board, a detail that makes the idea of open violence difficult to reconcile. Archaeologists and maritime historians have combed through what records remain: the ship's construction, the repair logs, the sworn statements of the Dei Gratia crew. In the 21st century, re-examinations of the story have attempted scientific tests, including experiments showing how alcohol fumes could indeed force an evacuation without leaving visible damage. Still, there is no final answer. The Mary Celeste was salvaged and sailed again for years, but her name became a kind of maritime shorthand for a vessel abandoned without explanation. Even today, when a modern ship is found drifting without crew, it is called a ghost ship, and the shadow of the Mary Celeste's mystery lingers in the telling. If the lower decks of a 17th century vessel were crowded, dark and noisy, the captain's cabin offered a different world entirely, though still confined by the ship's timbers. Imagine a space at the stern, where windows, called stern lights, opened out onto the sea. These panes let in a pale wash of daylight, something almost unheard of in the sleeping quarters of the crew. The cabin itself might be no larger than a modern walk-in closet, yet compared to the hammocks strung cheek by jowl below, it felt positively spacious. A small bed or cot stood to one side, often with fine bedding brought from home. A folding desk or chart table occupied another corner, its surface scattered with navigational tools, a brass compass, dividers for measuring distances on a map, rolled charts bound in leather, and a logbook in which the captain noted wind direction, speed, and the slow progress of the ship across the globe. Meals in the captain's cabin differed from the hard biscuits and salted meat of the forecastle. Here, there might be tinned or jarred preserves, cheese wrapped in waxed cloth, and wine or brandy carefully rationed. He might dine alone, or invite senior officers for a small council over plates of better-cooked fare, though even the finest meal on board still carried the tang of salt and smoke. The captain's work was constant. In this small room he studied charts, wrote letters to be delivered months or years later, and considered the delicate balance of discipline and morale. It was a place for private thought, but also for the burden of command, knowing every decision rippled through the crew, and in foul weather, through the fate of the voyage itself. At night, the cabin creaked with the ship's timbers, the sound of water slapping the hull just beyond the thin wooden walls. Oil lamps swung gently from hooks, casting a steady amber glow. It was a place apart, but never free from the motion and uncertainty of the sea. Imagine waking before the sun, not to the comfort of a warm home, but to the chill of the steppe air seeping into a felt tent, a ger or yurt, its wooden lattice walls creaking gently in the wind. Your bed is a thin layer of felt atop the packed earth, and the first thing you feel is the stiffness in your legs from the previous day's riding. Outside, your horse waits, its breath visible in the cold morning air. For a Mongol warrior, the horse was not only transport, but companion, tool, and lifeline. The day's journey would cover miles, sometimes dozens, sometimes more. There were no roads, only the grasslands and the endless sky. The weather could change in an instant. A warm breeze at midday giving way to an icy wind by afternoon. Meals were sparse and practical. Perhaps a strip of borts, dried meat shaved into thin slices, ready to be softened in hot water when time allowed. Or fermented mare's milk, arag, its tangy taste, a reminder of home. Vegetables were rare luxuries, fresh bread rarer still. Instead, the diet leaned heavily on what could be carried on horseback and preserved without spoiling. The saddle was your constant seat, its wooden frame unforgiving after hours of riding. Your hands would hold the reins loosely, yet always be ready to draw a bow or guide the horse over uneven ground. In the horde, movement was life. Staying in one place too long was not in the nature of the steppe. At night, campfires dotted the plain, casting small islands of light into the dark. The sounds of the camp were a mix of soft voices, the huff of horses, and the low crackle of burning dung fuel. The stars above were vast and cold, and somewhere beyond the firelight, the wind carried the faint howls of distant wolves. This was a life of constant endurance, of adjusting to the land rather than bending it to your will. For the Mongols, it was the rhythm of their existence. For an outsider, the sheer physical demand and lack of comfort would quickly sap both strength and spirit. Imagine the steppe again, vast, windswept, with grass bending in endless waves beneath a pale blue sky. It is here, sometime in the early 1160s, that a boy is born into the harsh and shifting world of the Mongol tribes. He is given the name Temujin, after a captured enemy warrior. His family belongs to a small, respected clan, but respect offers little protection on the steppe without power to back it. Temujin's early life is shaped not by plenty, but by scarcity. When his father, a minor chieftain, is poisoned by rivals, the boy is left to fend for his family. Still in his teens, he faces hunger, hostile tribes, and the constant threat of losing the few possessions his family clings to. He learns early that alliances, whether sealed through marriage, friendship, or mutual need, are the difference between survival and ruin. In these formative years, Temujin proves himself a careful judge of character. He surrounds himself with loyal companions, not merely kin, and rewards them with trust and responsibility. He understands that on the steppe, loyalty is a currency stronger than gold. Gradually, he gathers a following. Not all are warriors, some are herders, craftsmen, and scouts who know the land better than any map could capture. With each season, his influence spreads. When he defeats rival chieftains, he does not simply absorb their warriors. He reorganizes them into units where loyalty is to him personally, not to old tribal ties. By 1206, after years of shifting alliances, battles, and careful diplomacy, Temujin stands at a great gathering of the tribes. Here, beneath the open sky, he is proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler. It is the beginning of an empire that will stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the fringes of Europe. But in this moment, the sound is not of galloping horses or clashing steel. It is the murmur of voices in the wind, the smell of trampled grass, the quiet weight of expectation. From here, Genghis Khan will reshape the steppe's traditions into a disciplined force, one that moves like the wind, strikes with precision, and leaves deep marks on history. Yet even as the empire grows, the hardships of the ordinary warrior remain unchanged. Long days in the saddle, nights in the cold, and meals of dried meat under the same endless sky. The life of Genghis Khan is recorded in chronicles, oral traditions, and the careful writings of later historians. But his final resting place, that remains hidden. The year is 1227. The Khan dies. The exact cause, still uncertain. Some say illness, others a wound in battle, and a few whisper more unusual stories, involving omens and accidents. Whatever the truth, his death is kept secret at first. A leader's passing, especially one who commands the loyalty of vast armies, can unravel alliances overnight. His body, we are told, is taken back toward his homeland. The journey is quiet, guarded by a small group of loyal men. Legends tell that the soldiers escorting him killed all they met along the way, ensuring no one could reveal the route. The location of the tomb, if indeed it was a constructed tomb, is never recorded in official histories. Some stories say he was buried in the sacred Burkhan-Kolden mountain region, a place of personal reverence to him. Others believe the grave was left unmarked on an open stretch of steppe, so it would blend into the land he ruled. In some versions, rivers were diverted to cover the burial site, forever hiding it beneath flowing water. Centuries pass, the Mongol Empire fractures, memories blur, and the burial place becomes more legend than fact. Yet, from time to time, the search begins anew. In the 20th and 21st centuries, archaeologists, historians, and even amateur explorers turn their attention to Mongolia's vast landscapes. Some follow ancient texts, others use satellite imagery to scan for patterns in the earth. Yet there is a deep cultural sensitivity. Many Mongolians consider it disrespectful to disturb the possible resting place of the Great Khan. Even with modern tools, researchers often find themselves holding back, balancing curiosity with respect. One intriguing clue lies in a site called the Ik Korig, the Great Taboo. This was an area of over 240 square kilometers, sealed off for centuries, where entry was forbidden except to a few elite guards. Some believe the tomb may lie here, hidden among rolling hills, thickets of pine, and winding streams. And so the mystery endures. The wind still sweeps across the high grasslands. The mountains stand as they did 800 years ago, and somewhere, perhaps under a slope no one thinks to examine, or deep beneath a plain where wild horses graze, the Khan rests, undisturbed, his story still echoing through the silence of the steppe. Imagine yourself, after weeks on the open steppe, approaching a great encampment. The horizon is dotted, not with scattered ghares, but with a sprawling city of felt and silk, each tent belonging to an officer, a family of rank, or a visiting dignitary. At the heart of it all stands the Ordo, the Khan's own tent, often called the Golden Tent. It is larger than any you have seen. Its sides are made, not of simple wool felt, but of layered, decorated fabric, sometimes reinforced with wooden frames, its entrance marked by brightly painted poles. The air here is different. The sounds of horses and carts fade into the measured steps of guards, the low hum of conversation in many tongues, Persian, Chinese, Turkic, Mongolic, each voice subdued in the presence of power. Inside, the light is softened by patterned hangings. Banners embroidered with gold thread depict falcons, horses, and symbols of authority. The scent of burning juniper drifts through the air, cleansing and ceremonial. On the central dais the Khan sits flanked by his closest advisors. Around him, low tables are set for feasting, each holding delicacies gathered from across the empire. Roasted mutton, fermented mare's milk, spices from distant markets, and bowls of sweetened fruit. But this is not only a place for dining. It is a court, a council chamber, and a theater of diplomacy. Here emissaries from distant lands present tribute, fine cloth, carved ivory, silver ingots. In return, the Khan bestows gifts, a golden-laid sword, a fur cloak, a prized horse. Every gesture is deliberate, reinforcing bonds, reminding guests of the vast reach of Mongol power. Protocol dictates who sits where, who speaks first, and who may drink with the Khan. A single mistake can mean a loss of face, or worse. And yet, in this space, there is also a sense of grandeur. Here is the empire at its most formal, its most resplendent, a reminder that the same riders, who cross the frozen steppe with little more than dried meat and resolve, can also create an environment of astonishing ceremony and wealth. As the evening deepens, the tent glows with the light of hundreds of lamps. Musicians play low, steady rhythms on horsehead fiddles and drums. Songs are sung in praise of ancestors. Outside, the night wind carries the music far across the grasslands. You imagine drifting to sleep here, the voices fading, the lamplight soft, the scent of juniper still in the air, knowing that beyond the tent's walls lies an empire that stretches farther than the mind can follow.